got on screen here is for a couple students that for various reasons with this fall, things have not been super easy on campus, right? It's been harder than normal to even attend regular classes, not to mention attending a additional class. So what I've done, if you remember in the syllabus for the class, we only had 4 days of discussion forums, even though we have 6 days of content. And that was partly because the semester at Zhengda goes past the regular semester for Texas Tech. So what I'm doing, especially for students who maybe you missed an assignment or maybe you just were coming up short on your questions, if you want to earn some additional points, you can participate in these discussion sessions. So for example, the material that we're preparing today, the students in Taipei are going to be working on this material basically the week that we would be on Thanksgiving break. But you still have access to the Moodle page for the university there. So if you want to earn additional points, you're more than happy to go to that page and talk about Moral Panics, gaming, and VR. And all I need you to do is, if you do that, send me the screenshots of the post you made. I can tell you the early feedback has been really positive. I think there's been kind of a cool appreciation of getting a lot of extra voices from different places. I know I was talking to a couple of the students there just through email. And then some of them I actually had as students when I was teaching in Taipei in the springtime. So there has been some good early buzz. But for the stuff today, since we were not going to have an opportunity to discuss it afterwards, one of the things you can do, as I said, is you can go to the board and just as long as you post by that Friday night. So basically, if you were looking to participate in this, what I would suggest you do, log in there at the beginning of the week, make a couple of posts to get the conversation going, maybe respond to one or two, and then enjoy your Thanksgiving. And that's probably the best way to go. And then you can also explain why we're gone for Thanksgiving, because obviously these holidays work a little differently. Although one of the years that I was in Taipei, I was there during Thanksgiving, and so my colleagues threw me a Thanksgiving dinner in Taiwan, which was pretty damn cool. Has anybody on the phone had hot pot before?
I have.
Yeah, it was, Alex, it was like the most magnificent hot pot you can possibly think of, because it was like a celebratory one. And I think I slept for a day and a half after eating it. I mean, it was pretty amazing.
We just put a whole turkey in the fryer.
That is the Texas way. Just fry the whole thing.
Fry it with all sorts of good spices, and that's such a good turkey.
Fry it and we'll figure it out later. Yeah, so... yeah, if you want, and even if you're not looking for bonus points and you just want to talk about this stuff, the nice thing about this week is the material, I think, there's a lot more to talk about. Because as you probably saw in the readings, a lot of it is really undetermined, right? Especially with the VR stuff, we're only just getting started with our VR content. So in terms of Moral Panic. So jump in there, If you do, just send me an email on Friday with your screenshots and I'll go in. And what I'll do is I'll create an extra grading column. It's not worth any points. So any points you get would be additional for your grade. Okay. And that'll work just fine. A very quick quiz. Someone define immersion for me.
Immersion is the sensation that one is within some confine of something. So a good example would be when somebody is reading a book and they feel as if they can see what is going on around them. They are invested within the world that is built around them. And
so this is one of those areas that gets tricky, because what Alex is talking about, I think, is what lots of people are talking about. But the issue with that definition is it sounds an awful lot like what? Another one from class.
Presence.
It sounds almost identical to presence. And as a result, things get, and narrative engagement, right? Things get really, really tricky when you're studying VR and games. And part of the reason is that we tend to use a lot of terms in a metaphorical sense when we really mean for them to have kind of an underlying definition. What I'm going to sell to you, at least for the next couple of weeks, is a way to try to remove that confusion. Because I think we all know what Alex is talking about. And the word immersion seems like it explains it. The complication comes from the other definitions that we have for very specific concepts, like the illusion of non-mediation or, a transportation to a story world. I am going to sell the idea that when we talk about immersion, we're often talking about a technology side variable. And we're talking about presence and narrative engagement and sense of place. We're talking about a perception variable. The argument is that because we know how the human body experiences the world, there are 5 senses, right? And those 5 senses are how we know our reality. One of the things we've been trying to do in VR research is define immersion as technically, like literally, the extent to which the thing you're wearing absorbs your senses. This is the idea of progressive embodiment. So like the more of your sight, touch, taste, hearing, and sound is absorbed by a technology, the more immersive it is. And then the results of being immersed, if you think about immersion as literally I'm dipping you in something, right? The results of that are feelings of presence or feelings of narrative engagement or feelings of sense of place. And the reason we've been trying to put, and I say we, I mean a lot of VR and gaming researchers, have been trying to push this definition, is it helps us distinguish whether or not we're talking about systems design or if we're talking about player experiences. It's something I want you to think about for the next couple of weeks. And admittedly, it's tricky because if you go to the literature, you're going to find somebody else talking about it in a different way and somebody else talking about it in a different way. Presence and immersion and narrative engagement and transportation and sense of place, these words get used interchangeably. And what's starting to happen is our development gets more complicated and it's becoming harder to figure out what 2 different people are talking about. If you're interested more on this topic, I'm hoping maybe sometime soon to teach like a class on presence, like a 3-hour legitimate, like here's how presence in VR work. Because I think there's enough material there to unpack this one. But I'm going to sell the notion that when we talk about immersion in here, just to keep the conversation focused, we're talking about the act of being immersed, taking your senses. So if you're wearing an HMD and you've got headphones in and you've got gloves on, right, that's more immersive than if you only have a remote in your hand. Now, that doesn't mean that you're automatically more present, right? Because if the VR headset's terrible and the video game controller is naturally mapped or perceived to be naturally mapped, right, you might feel more present in the video game. In fact, many of you have probably dealt with this, where the virtual reality version of something was actually worse than just the regular old like keyboard version of something. That can happen sometimes. And our argument there is that it's not just the immersion. There's something in the translation between what's on screen, what you're wearing, and then what you're experiencing in the end. Okay? I'm going to focus us on the idea of immersion as embodiment. Oh, go ahead, Jared. I'm sorry. I cut you off.
It's fine. Something interesting to note is because the modern video game controllers are nationally mapped, that's affected the way VR controllers are built.
In fact, it's a good point. I just gave an interview yesterday with Le Monde, the newspaper in Paris, in France. And the interview was about the PS5 controller. And we were talking about the golden hands rule. And one of the things I was explaining to him is one of the reasons the controller really hasn't changed that much over the years is that there's been no reason for it to change. Like, the things that we're interfacing with aren't any different. They've gotten, like, sexier and cooler looking, but the idea of, like, rotating left and right with your index finger, and it's not changed. And our discussion was on VR, and I had explained that the next probable change in controller design will probably be when there's a reason to actually need more input. But of course, in VR, as Jared's getting at, the VR video games are largely mapped to the same controllers as the non-VR video games. And so the headset's really more of a, you get more information, you get more sound, you can look around. And one of the things we talked about in the interview was that the future of VR is probably not just going to be video games. It will be other types of experiences that might need other types of control interfaces, up to and including having, ironically, no controller, right? Which would be the most natural of all. Which, to go back to immersion, that will be an example of extreme immersion. Like if I'm wearing a bodysuit and then that bodysuit is kicking smells into my nose and I can taste things, like at that point, you're just having reality, but through an illusion, if that makes any sense. But yeah, Jared, it was go ahead.
I don't think we'll move away from the buttons and the stick anytime soon.
Well, that was our conversation. We were like, at the end of the day, there hasn't been a need to. Like, those buttons and sticks work well enough, especially if you're playing video games. And that goes back to the idea of perceptions of natural mapping, right? We talked about the keyboard. Basically, I think our lecture 2 was our entire conversation with the newspaper, right? So yeah, Alex, I think you are dead on with how the term is used. I think that's how everybody uses it. But I think you're going to see that changing as we try to distinguish between immersive systems and then feeling present. And part of it, I think, is the term presence hasn't caught on as much. I think immersion has caught on a lot more than presence has.
I think it also has to do with the fact that the two words are essentially synonyms in certain regards. And so finding a specific distinction between the two different phrases is very hard to do.
That's been one of the hardest things. And to tell you, to be honest with you, the problem with that is that they never should have been synonyms. But a lot of the early researchers didn't distinguish between them. And so I think you're right, Alex. At some point, they just became to mean the same thing. Kind of like how a democracy and a republic aren't the same thing. They do have technical differences that are important, right? But we use them synonymously so much, right, that most people do not distinguish between the two, right? We don't, we have a representative system of government. We don't have a full-on democracy, but the distinctions between those often don't matter. In this case, I'm going to argue they do, and it has to do with one is a tech variable and one's a psychological variable. And then the reason that's important, right, is that the tech variable predicts the psychological variable. Or the problem we have in VR and most interactive media is that we expect a one-to-one correlation between being immersed and feeling present. And yet, time and time again, we don't find it. And a good example of that was the natural mapping discussion from a couple weeks ago. You would think a controller that uses your hands is better than one that doesn't. And yet, time after time in data, we find that Jared's buttons and sticks are better than the natural action of hand motions. So let's keep this going as we go through. And this actually might be something that even after the class we continue to talk about, because it's an area of research for my lab. When I have a lab again. Update on the lab, by the way. We've gotten our new television set. We've gotten our PC rigged up to our different controllers. We're still installing our VR sensors for our more sort of domestic grade stuff. So like your HTC Vive, I guess the Quest doesn't need sensors, things like that. What we're doing right now is we're going more towards like a consumer grade model for the short term, where we're just going to have like a simulated living room, and you would walk in and then the different technologies would be ready to use. And then we've put in a bid for a cave, but that's probably going to be down the road. In part because my research has pivoted a little bit. And while the cave is really interesting, if you think about VR technology, the cost has come down to the point where you don't really need to study the cave stuff. You can study consumer grade stuff because that's what people are actually using, right?
And you heard of the Deca gear?
I have not.
I know it was posted in the VR Club a couple times. It's looking to be, and everyone's super skeptical right now, but the company continues to promise this, and there's some other confirmations. But it's a $450 VR headset.
Oh, I did see this. Yes, I did see this.
Display and basically Valve Index controllers, which I was like, whoa.
Yeah, there's been some pushback against Oculus's new decision to tether to Facebook accounts one-to-one, and I saw the Deca come up. We're still in conversations with Infinidec, but I don't think anything's going to happen. I'm thinking COVID's taken a toll, and I don't think companies are looking at doing partnerships right now. But maybe. So in the back of our minds, we've got this Infinidec conversation going, but I don't see it happening. But we'll see. We'll see. Who knows? Maybe something miracle will happen. All right. So today is about moral panic, and it's one of my favorite topics because in some ways it has nothing to do with gaming in VR. This is a topic that's much deeper than gaming in VR. At the same time, it has so many implications for how we go about thinking about gaming in VR and other technologies. So a lot of today, in the beginning especially, we'll be talking about things that are going a bit backwards to see where moral panic comes from. I have a lot of stuff on gaming because I study moral panics in games. And so I'll talk about some of the things that we've talked about in our writings when it comes to the VR side, to be honest with you, that stuff's pretty brand new. And there isn't a whole lot of discussion. I might even go so far as to argue that one reason we're not seeing a lot of moral panic in VR is VR still isn't rolled out yet. So it's one of these weird technologies that it doesn't quite have the rollout where folks are freaking out. It's still in the innovation stage. It's still in the early adopter stage. And we'll talk about, but this is a good time to talk about it because you might want to start thinking about what would the moral panics be and how will we discuss those things. One interesting conversation that's come up. So I just published a paper in the Frontiers of Communication yesterday with a colleague of mine from Georgia named Sunju Grace An. And she's one of the leading scholars in VR. And her argument is that one reason that VR hasn't been criticized as much is that it doesn't have the same gaming content yet. To the average person, VR is still seen as kind of space age, and it's not seen as a gaming technology, which in some ways may actually be protecting it a little bit because it's not getting some of the same, like we're not seeing Call of Duty VR at the level that you would see like walking into the store tomorrow.
I don't know. There's some pretty brutal VR games.
There's a lot of stuff, but it's not well known.
Yeah, I'd say so. It's not as bad as like Mortal Kombat, but
yeah. And so that was her discussion, was that the cultural conversation around VR, oddly, has shifted away from video games. And that may be one reason why people, ironically, Jared, aren't picking on the things that are actually really crazy. And so we'll talk about that. And so she'll talk about how, and maybe we'll address it in a couple minutes. Like, why is that happening? Because I think a lot of people do think VR video game, but there seems to be some different cultural underpinnings there.
Yeah, it happens all the time. Like, I'm sorry, Riley, you want to go?
Oh, go ahead, Javi.
Okay. I was going to say, like, that happened recently with the Joker film. There was moral panic behind that.
Mm-hmm. And, of course, films have historically had panics behind them, you know.
Yeah, it still happens today. It's not just games. It's mostly with anything, I guess, kind of mainstream.
I think that's the key. It's the mainstream argument. And if something isn't quite mainstream yet, and it hasn't emerged as a... And this could actually be some good research to do, some good survey work. But there seems to be a sense that VR is often talked about in technical and clinical terms. Like it's training, it's, scientist stuff, but it's not touched yet. Again, that might sound foreign to us, but we have to remember the people on the call today, we're kind of the early adopters, right? I mean, we're very much on that like front end of a technology. Another one is that we see so many versions of it, right? Like Google Glass VR or AR cardboard and things of that nature, right? There seems to be the narrative of using it for education and training from the get-go. And that could be something else that we talk about. So, all right. Well, let me jump into what moral panics are. And then we're going to kind of rewind this. But I want to get you thinking, especially for today, I'm going to need some input from y'all because some of this stuff is not well known. We're going to have to establish it like as we go. Okay. All right. So, moral panic, the quick definition of a moral panic. Condition, episode, person, or group of persons emerges. They are defined as a threat. Okay. It's when a part of society sort of presumes that the choices of another part of society are not good. Okay. Essentially, what we're talking about here are disruptions to status quos. Situations where people are doing something new and other people don't like it. And more often than not, the people that are doing something new are in the minority. And of course, that's important because if they're in the minority and they're doing something new, it's very easy to consider their behavior to be deviant. So you're doing things that we don't do. And as a result of that, you're being deviant, and that needs to stop. Because you have to remember that technologies, by their definition, are inherently disruptive. Because what do technologies do? Like, what is their purpose in society when we develop a technology? What are we normally trying to do at a broad level?
Improve life, just in general.
Improve life, and of course, that requires something to happen, which usually requires a change, right? hey, I see you putting shoes on those horses and feeding them oats, and they only walk so fast, and like the country's getting bigger. That doesn't seem like it's very tenable in the long term. So I'm going to develop this carriage that's horseless, and it can go faster. And all I have to do is light a fire in front of it, and then it will move by itself, which means I don't have to like feed it all the time and like care for it in the winter.
Sounds like we're getting lazier.
That's what it sounds like, isn't it? It's like, oh, you're just being lazy. You're getting rid of horses. What are the furriers gonna do? They're gonna put them out of business, right? Now I don't have anybody to horseshoe anymore. What about the horse market? What about horse traders? Like, it's disruptive. And these things go back and forth. And we deal with this constantly. So technologies scare people because they force a change. You know, some of the fears around, using electric cars. Well, what are we going to do with all the gas stations and the refineries? Right? Like, these are things that come up, and they're not totally unfounded because technologies do require change. At the same time, the discussion is always, well, short-term versus long-term benefits, right? Most of us have benefited pretty well. Do you know why air conditioning was originally invented? Does anybody have a clue? I'm just curious.
It was initially a way to store foods for longer, to my knowledge.
So,
the system that we know today was... Initially, it was a food storage system because we knew that food wouldn't spoil nearly as soon when it was cold, like when it was frozen. So we needed to find a way to cool down areas in order to store food better.
So that was my understanding for freezing processes. And AC may have played a role in that. What I've always understood...
Something military related.
Believe it or not, I was printing. Printing presses. The paper would warp and bend, and it would mold. And they were trying to keep things more preserved. It's on the lines of what Alex is talking about with, like, we know that if you keep temperatures cooler, you can control environments better. And who knows, Alex, it may have also been used in the food process. Certainly we have walk-in coolers and things like that, right? And blocks of ice and ice boxes and things like that. What I'm getting at, of course, is oftentimes technologies initially have one very different use. And then, of course, people started learning, hey, it's kind of nice in here. It's pleasant in this room, right? But they weren't developed as a comfort thing. Whether it's food or printing, it was a very functional thing. They weren't designed for us to live in the air conditioning, right? And of course, if anybody's traveled overseas, AC is not as common in other parts of the world. When I'm over in Germany, it's very rare to find a building with AC. In part because it's a very different approach on the environment. In part, most of the buildings were built to cool themselves. My apartment in Erfurt was built in the 1500s. It's just built tall, so all the warm air goes up into the belfry and out. And so if you're in the building, it's actually pretty pleasant in there. The stones retain moisture, things stay cool, and things like that. Well, the point I'm making, of course, is that technologies on their surface are made to make things easier. But it's not always that simple, right? And normally I would talk about the diffusion of innovation, but I kind of kept it out of this conversation just because I didn't want to load it down with too much extra stuff. A lot of moral panics are directed at the youth, right? It's the Maud Flanders effect, right? More often than not, when we see a moral panic, the us are adults and the them are children. And of course, why is that? What are some reasons for that?
Adults generally have a platform that children didn't have. I feel like this is changing with TikTok and social media, stuff like that. But
yeah, you could argue that, Riley, that, if you're the adult in the room, you have the mic, right? Or traditionally, you've always had the mic. So that's not a bad argument. Yeah, it's like I can speak up because I have the microphone. And of course, that could be changing with newer platforms that democratize voices, right? That's a good point.
I can actually shoehorn my question in here. Based on what Riley just said. One of my questions is has social media and the access to instant communication and instant information led to the greater frequency of moral panics, and if so, what parts may contribute?
Let me hold that one to slide 8 because I'm going to show a model of where the media plays a role in moral panics because I think it's going to be a better discussion in about 3 slides. But it's a good one. And so I'll put a pin in it, come back to it in 3 slides. So one reason is probably that adults have the microphone. What are some other reasons that might be obvious, but we still should state them?
One thing in the readings we did, the Goldilocks effect, where each generation feels like they had media just right.
Yes, that's Benjamin. I'm going to stop calling you Brandon one of these days. And yes, that's exactly right. Everybody thinks they had it right. We had it just right. The folks, and of course, the funny thing is that generation thought the generation before them was silly. And they think the generation below them is silly. And every generation thinks that they're doing it right. And so anytime one generation looks back on another, they're always concerned that those kids are doing it differently than us. And of course, what Benjamin's pointing out is every generation thinks that. So either they're all in the middle, or nobody was in the middle, or maybe norms just change. But the Goldilocks effect is strong. You know, how many of your parents only listen to music from the 70s and 80s? Because anything past that is garbage, right? I do this. I am really bad about, I only listen to music from the 90s. Anything past that, it doesn't connect with me, right? Comic books. I read Marvel comics, but I only read the ones that were published like late 80s to about 98. I don't read a lot of the new stuff. Even though the new stuff is demonstrably more complex and interesting. Like some of the stories being told today are far more interesting and adult because in the 90s, we still had the comics code. And we'll talk about that in a minute, right? So the Goldilocks effect's a really strong one because what Benjamin's saying is if I think my generation did it right, then by definition, what's the other generation doing? They're doing it wrong. So great connection there. Any other ones, Jared?
I know what you're talking about. Obviously, we're doing it right.
Yeah. We're here. We're rolling. Of course we did it right. What are they doing? And of course, the one that I think we're skipping is the obvious one. They don't know better than just kids. And our job is to make sure they do it right. Right? So we teach the people below us how to grow up to not do things wrong in the future. Like that's what most working adults would see as like their job, right? So all of these things conspire, and partly I pointed out because I don't think it's always like we hate children. People just get terrified of people doing it wrong. Sam mentioned maybe that music was just better, and Sam, I'm not going to argue with you on that. Yeah. I've got my Nirvana. In fact, you may have read that last year, I think, was the first year since basically the 80s that record sales outpaced CDs. Like vinyl records are selling more than CDs. Because there's a kind of a nostalgia kick. Now, part of that is that CDs aren't as popular because how do we buy music today? Digital. But there's still people like me who've got their vinyl player. And I've been going back and like Nirvana has been putting vinyl out. Run DMC has been putting vinyl out. Like going back and finding like repressings of 90s music. And that's pretty wild. Well, what happens here is we start talking about folk devils. And it's this like, the kids are doing something weird and it's going to run them the wrong way. And I'm going to take us back to the 60s. Anybody know who's on screen right now? I'm just curious if you know these stereotypes. It's okay if you don't. Just from the early 60s, late 50s, early 60s. And these are two very different types of stereotype. And have you ever seen the movie West Side Story? Or read the play or seen the musical? Or
Sadly, no.
So what you got on screen are the mods and the rockers. And so the mods were the preppy guys with the fancy scooter and the knit sweater vest, right? And like the 60s version of Sperry's, right? The clean cut kids. And the rockers were the motorcycle guys, leather jackets, Hellraisers. And they would run around England and just terrorize the place because they hated each other, right? Now, this would be a great example. So once I start giving them names, I start theming them. Does that make sense? I start identifying them as a group of people. Them, the mods, the rockers, right? The deviants. Because look at them with their scooters and their shoes that fit weird and their boots. What respectable working class man wears boots, right? In fact,
whoa. What are you talking about, boots?
That's the discussion, right? This would be the whole thing. Well, think about it in Texas, it'd be the opposite, right? Like, why are you not wearing boots? What the hell are those tennis shoes that are so popular among the youth these days, right? Theming gets interesting. What's on screen here, that's a respectable 60s man. That's an adult.
Yeah.
So, us, right? The group in society that says this is how you're supposed to behave. And them, right? They are the deviants. And of course, the deviant doesn't choose their label, right? We choose their label for them. So how do we tend to describe video gamers? I don't mean us, I mean culturally.
Like in a negative way?
Go into detail though.
Well, like some people like antisocial.
Antisocial's a big one.
Yeah.
Okay, what are some other ones?
Maybe stinky.
Antisocial, bad hygiene.
They assume that people who play video games literally do nothing but play video games.
Right, like all they do is play games and that's it. Like it's games. In fact, I don't shower because I game. I have no friends. Right, like that's it. There's a lot of stereotypes, right? Once you start theming somebody, it makes it easier to also label their behavior as deviant. Now, why might we see these stereotypes? A couple of you mentioned your questions because the generation above us didn't play games. They didn't have them. And when they did, they existed in a very different format, right? So for your parents, most of their video games were probably in an arcade, publicly. And if your parents are older, it would have been in what kind of places? Bars, bowling alleys, places where you drink and smoke. So games started off as like tavern games, like darts, bowling, and then like darts, billiards, and then like Pac-Man in the corner, right? And then, of course, arcades became a little more friendly, and it was like the mall arcade or the strip mall arcade, right? But the whole idea of like playing with your family and playing at home, that's my generation. People who are in their 30s now, we're the ones that kind of grew up with the home console. And if you think about it, those are very different behaviors. One of them is you leave work, you skip school, you go to the bar and play video games. I was reading an article this morning about like people are so nervous about video games because like you go to the laundromat and they put a video game machine at the laundromat. Why would they put a video game machine at the laundromat?
So you could play while like waiting for your clothes.
Yeah, like it takes a while to, if anybody's ever done their clothes at a public laundromat, it's boring. You just sit there and you can't do anything. So putting a video game would be great. Well, guess who would play the video game? It wasn't the people from the neighborhood, it was kids. And so they would like run over to the laundromat and play video games and like make fun of old ladies doing their laundry. You can see how that would lead to a moral panic, like a bunch of 14-year-olds high on sugar, like playing Street Fighter 2, and like Miss Maisel's in the corner, like folding her underwear, and the kids are like, "Look at Grandma, she's stupid." Like when I was a kid, we used to play video games at a convenience store in town, and it was Captain America and the Avengers, and there'd be like 12 kids crawling all over this video game machine while people are like trying to buy groceries. You know, we were loud and we'd get in fights with each other. You know, now a lot of that's probably just kids being kids, but you can see how those things get connected. Look at those games. Look at those deviants. They're not behaving in ways. Because what do kids do when they're not around their parents?
Misbehave.
They misbehave. Like, you test the boundaries of what you're allowed to do. So you can see kind of these things going down. So the point I'm making here is just that you can kind of see how these cultures emerge, where there's a proper way of doing things. And there's an improper way of doing things. And of course, none of this is objective. These are all cultural perspectives, right? And then, I mean, we haven't even gotten into issues of actually being minority status in these environments. We're just talking about like labels that we're giving people. And then you start layering in other dynamics, and it starts to get very complicated very quickly, right? Mm-hmm. And again, we'll go back later and talk about some of the gamer stereotypes. But okay, so slide 8, where I wanted Jared to come in. First, let me explain that one of the things that happens in these moral panics, so fears start to arise from somewhere. A parent, a principal, somewhere in society, somebody gets upset. And at some point, those fears end up, let's say like a crime happens, for example. Like some mods and rockers actually get into a fight in a parking lot. Or like some kid really does like steal an old lady's purse at the laundromat. Well, once that happens, or someone does play a video game, gets in a fight at school, and someone says, why'd you do it? And they go, because Mortal Kombat told me to. Once that happens, it becomes news coverage. Right? At some point, the newspaper covers it. The television station covers it. The magazines cover it because it happened. That's how news works. You cover things. And once it hits the news cycle, it becomes widespread. Everyone reads it. Now, anecdotes are not fake. Okay, they're not false. Anecdote doesn't mean it's not real. It just means that, well, what is an anecdote?
It's a personal experience.
It's a personal experience. It definitely happened, but in science, we don't usually accept anecdote as evidence of an underlying phenomenon. And why is that?
Because you're the outlier.
Well, we don't know if you're the outlier. We can't automatically say you're the outlier.
Statistics is just a collection of anecdotes.
So some people would argue that in a way, if you have enough anecdotes and they all show the same exact pattern, maybe then you have evidence of something. But evidence of something once is not evidence of a theory or an explanation, right? One anecdote, an N of 1, a sample size of 1, does not allow you to rule out other reasons. Does that make sense? Like, yeah, your kid plays video games, and your kid's a shit. I don't deny either one of these things. But that may not be reason enough to say this caused this. Or
right, because there can be anecdotal evidence where like a kid says, well, I play that game and I'm doing fine.
Yeah, because somebody else's anecdote is also an N of 1. And you're exactly right, Javi. And that's where things get tricky. Because we just fight back and forth. Think of all of the political stuff you've seen lately. Well, I knew this Democrat once that ate a baby. Like, okay, maybe. I'm sure there was one. I don't know. Like, there's 420 million people in the United States. One of them probably did something that heinous. And I knew a Republican once that kicked a small child and called him a weirdo. Like, that's not evidence of anything except that one person's really bad, right? And so a lot of times we lob anecdotes back and forth. This happens in moral panics. And the problem with anecdotes is you're making a claim that X causes Y, and there's so many other variables in that equation, you can't control for any of them. That's why we do research. In research studies, we control for all that stuff. If you give one person a pill and their COVID goes away, you can't claim the pill caused COVID to go away. We don't know. So you have to give the pill to lots of people and then see if more often than not, does the pill result in the disease going away? And then if it does, are the side effects worse than the actual? There's a lot you have to do. It's why trials take a long time. It turns out the human body, we don't understand it nearly as well as we think we do. One of the biggest misunderstandings of medicine is that it's an exact science. It's pretty amazing, actually, like the rate of error among medications and surgeries and things like that. Go ahead, Jared.
I heard somewhere that we don't even know how anesthesia works. It's just
we don't. We don't have an underlying theory of anesthesia. It's pretty amazing. We just have a lot of data showing that when you knock people out, you can cut them open and stitch them back together and they wake up. I mean, it happens more often than not, but there is not a like strong reason. There's even some discussions that we're not entirely sure why humans sleep, for that matter. Like, we just don't understand sleep very well. It's interesting to think about these things, right? So
Let me go ahead and ask my question.
yeah, let me frame it for you. So, like, if the media plays a role in spreading moral panics, Jared's question now becomes interesting because you're asking what?
Has social media and the access to instant communication and instant information led to the greater frequency of moral panics? And if so, what parts contribute?
What do we think?
I think yes, personally.
It almost has to, right? Because you have several layers. One could be anecdotes spread faster, right? I could just tell a story. I could just show something and go, here it is. Here's my kid, and they're doing a thing, and now they're doing a thing, right? One, of course, is that the news spreads faster through social media. You know, social media is not like a separate thing from news. You know, the New York Times has a Twitter account, right? And I guess those are the two things I would say that contribute the most, is that our own personal anecdotes can spread faster. News can spread faster. Oh, the third one would be news can spread faster through our social networks in which we attach our anecdotes to them. So I can give you my information, I can give you their information, or I can give you their information with my opinion. And all three of those things result in things going really, really fast, right? So you're probably right, I would suspect.
The thing is with news is that a lot of the time nowadays, it's more about being first rather than being correct.
And one extension of that is the notion of correct doesn't always mean the same thing. You know, correct might just be I'm reporting it live, but like by definition, I'm not correct because it's not over yet, right? Right. I think of Bubba Wallace and the noose in his garage. You know, it turns out after a few days that, you know, according to the investigation, it seems like it was a massive misunderstanding that, you know, this garage has always had this particular knot used as a handle to close the garage door. Now, hey, that's crazy, and they should probably not do that anymore. Personal opinion, but it's maybe just we don't need to use this knot for lots of things anymore.
Still a news.
But the thing is, everyone said, oh, Bubba Wallace was lying. Well, he wasn't lying. At the time, that was the truth, right? Remember, and it wasn't a black driver that reported it. It was his team. They went to the garage, opened the door, and they saw a noose hanging in their garage. They reported it immediately. That was the news that day, wasn't it? And then the next day was NASCAR's reaction, which was a solidarity reaction. And then the next day, as the investigation went on, it turns out it was a misunderstanding. None of those are fake. They're all real. They're just real at a slice in time. Does that make sense? So people are like, haha, it's all a hoax. Well, no, it was never a hoax. Sometimes we just misunderstand things. Right? Like, that's how the news works. And so to Javier's point, it moves so quickly now that sometimes the truth is relative to a point in time, but those point in times happen so fast that it becomes relative. I mean, we can look back on the American Revolution, and it turns out the Boston Massacre was kind of a hoax. It happened, but not in the way that Paul Revere's etching of the British, officers ordering on the firing of innocent colonials happened. It was more of a street fight, right? Where both sides basically said, let's do this thing. Like a Jets and Sharks kind of thing. That's not what we learned in history class, right? In history class, all the colonials were sitting around eating turkey, and then the British came in and said, we're going to kill all of you Bostonians now. Truth's always relative. And in a fast news cycle where there's new voices that aren't always vetted, truth becomes remarkably relative. To Javier's point, we favor speed over accuracy. Right? We're actually talking about in the department about having I don't think we teach a long form journalism class. Like the old school style of journalism where you write like the 10,000 word investigative piece. And we're talking about maybe that needs to happen, like a newfound appreciation for let's just take a sit back. Thinking about Bob Woodward's book, which is a novel length investigation into the White House compared to a nibble in February. But of course, what's the drawback of that? If you wait 6 months to release something, you get yelled at for putting it out too late. People are like, well, why didn't you tell us sooner about the president and COVID? And his answer is because I was writing a book. And if I tell everybody in February, guess what happens to the interviews in March and April and May and June? They go away, right? So there's a lot of conversation here. But I think you're right, Jared. I think it does play a role. It's something that would be fun to study from like a sociology of science. And I think Javier hits a point very well, that we do see a preference towards like the quick and dirty as opposed to like, the long and accurate. And then of course, as audiences, we think of the truth differently. And then of course, there's a whole set of standards around how we process fake news. I teach a course on fake news at Tech. And one of the things I teach the students every week is it's often your fault. Like we fall for heuristics, we fall for cognitive shortcuts, we fall for logical fallacies, because at the end of the day, when it becomes us versus them, well, you're either an us or you're a them. And once that happens, which arguments do you listen to? You listen to the ones that support you. And so the ones that reject you, you just ignore, and that becomes a problem. So moral panics are complicated. And once they hit the public sphere of discussion, they're even more complicated. There's some ones in the past. One of my favorite was the written word. So apparently, it says Plato here. That should be Socrates. Right? Was terrified of writing. And one of the arguments is that people will simply write things down and pass them around instead of retaining and understanding the information. What's the critique here? And the idea that words cannot speak for themselves.
Context is everything.
Context can play a role. I think that's a good point. Like, you can see a sentence, but absent of the speaker, you don't necessarily know how it was delivered. Many of you have seen campaign ads where they take someone's words and just stick them on a piece of paper. Like one of them is Joe Biden saying, "I don't even know why I'm here." And then the ad was, "Is he suffering cognitive decline?" I'm like, I don't think he was asking the crowd, "I don't know why I'm here." I think he said it once, but that's out of context, right? And we could go both ways, obviously. That's just one I saw this morning. So one could be context matters. Another one is, and I guess related to that, is how often we take someone's words to mean what we want them to mean. Anybody on this call who studies religion, whether it's formally or informally, whether it's as somebody who's religious or study it as a hobby, the whole debate between the many different sects of a religion are, how do you interpret these words? Right? Some people say it says this, some people say it says this. Constitutional debates. Like, when we say it's in the Constitution, I got to tell you, it doesn't really mean anything because it's interpretive. And even we debate that, whether it's interpretive or literal, right? There's a great episode of The Simpsons where they find out that, like, every man in town gets, like, 4 pigs and 2 virtuous women of true or something like this. And, like, where is my pigs, right? We can debate these things. And, of course, that was meant to be a joke on how we interpret the law. Some of it would be, think about some of the most dangerous books in history. Mein Kampf gets written to inspire an entire movement of genocide, right? So in some ways, Socrates wasn't wrong. It's just that, do we care? I mean, why do we write things down? So we don't forget them. There's also some of the most impactful writings in society we use to this day to help us move along, like the Constitution or, the collected wisdom of our civil rights leaders, right? We use these things all the time. We use quotes and stories and readings, and you read for class, you take notes for class, Well, remember, when Socrates lived, knowledge was more rhetorical, wasn't it? It was argumentation. It was how much do you know, with what passion, and how do you deliver it? And so knowledge was every bit about the speaker as it was about the knowledge itself. If anybody's ever taken a debate class, you know what I'm talking about. So you could see how the idea of writing down questions and answers instead of debating them in front of your peers, that was a shift to the status quo. Does that make sense? Like, all of a
No one's
sudden,
challenging like the information.
no one's challenging the information anymore. You're not responsible for your knowledge anymore. Yeah, like that's a big shift in knowledge from debate and rhetoric to written. Now, if you follow the scientific method, we would argue that rhetoric has no role. It's not supposed to be persuasive. Like, the persuasion is the argument. It's not my delivery of the argument. Go to a conference sometime. You'll see some of the worst you'll see professors who teach public speaking who give presentations on their research, and they're terrible presentations because they just disassociate between my kids have to give good speeches and I just have to give knowledge. So, you know, we can joke about it, of course. And, you know, one of the biggest ironies is Socrates' students were the ones that wrote this argument down. Right? So it's like, we know about the argument because he wrote it out. It's in the Phaedrus if you ever want to read the argument. But yeah, there was a debate that like the written word was going to destroy knowledge. You don't have to remember things anymore. You're not responsible for your arguments anymore. They can be taken out of context. Again, many of those things aren't untrue. It's just, did they actually destroy knowledge? Probably not. And many of us would probably argue that we've gotten smarter over the years rather than the other way around. We just think differently. Googling things doesn't make you dumb. You can Google more stuff than you used to. Most engineers don't do calculations by hand because they have devices that can do them for you, but you also learn the underlying math so you can spend more time thinking about more complex things. And we could talk about this. Printed books were terrifying. Maybe you've heard of the banned books list. You know, for the longest time, reading certain books or having certain books was enough to get you killed. Why would the Catholic Church be so against books?
Because they open your mind to other ideas, maybe.
Most of them were challenging the church's authority, right? Most of the books that they banned were challenging prominent dogma from the Vatican at this time. And the reason I use the Catholic Church for this example is if you follow world history, you'll see that the Vatican had a lot of power in the Middle Ages. In fact, it would be considered a nation state of considerable power, right? This list existed until the 60s, 1960s, until they finally said, okay, we're not going to ban books anymore, right? Yeah, and Alex pointed out it wasn't just any book. Non-Latin versions of the Bible were often banned.
Punishable by death.
Yeah, if anybody here is Protestant, you have read about this. Martin Luther's big beef, well, he had 99 beefs at the Catholic Church, right? But one of them was like, quit lecturing people in Latin. And what was his critique? I'm just curious if you know it.
Well, the 95 Thesis, that's a lot of different things.
Just the one about Latin. Like, why? His big thing was like, stop preaching in Latin.
It's because nobody knew.
No one knew it. People were going to mass on Sunday, and like some old white guy was yelling at them in Latin, and they're just sitting there. What's he saying? Like, that sounds funny, but that was accurate. And the Bible was printed in Latin, and it was all Latin. And of course, Luther was like, we should write it in German because they're Germans, and if you write it in German, they can be closer to their creator if that's your belief system, right? And his whole thing was about corruption in the church and that religion's about being closer to the creator rather than going to church on Sunday and paying for your sins. And they tried to kill him for that because it was like, no, it's a power move, right? And if you start giving people their own language and their own Bible and tell them it's okay not to come to church as long as you're a virtuous person, that challenges like everything that we've been telling them in Latin for all this time. And I believe some folks have suggested that much of the written German language can be traced back to the earliest translations of the Bible, because it was one of the first times that the Germanic languages were written down anywhere. And yes, Alex, and 94 other complaints. But that being one of them. And all of them being around power structures. You know, and his argument was that, hey, man, I don't need all of this fancy stuff to be in power. Fun fact, for those students on the call here at Tech, we have a summer program at the University of Erfurt, that's where Martin Luther received his divinity degree. And so it's, whether you're religious or not, as a comm scholar, it's a really interesting thing to study in communication. And so it is kind of cool to go to the university that in 15, whenever, he got his degree. 14, whenever. I think it's older than that. His dormitory is now a tourist attraction. So maybe one of you will be like such a badass student that they will make your dorm room a monument. Like seal it up and like, okay, this is where Jared lived. You know, that guy. He lived here. And they'll leave all like the empty wrappers just laying around and just like, no, that's genius fuel. That's what that was. You know.
There's no need to call me out like that.
No, it's in the museum, man.
Actually, no. Right here.
Like this one. This is when I thought about the quantum particle. It's right here. It's in this wrapper.
It seems like a good place to ask one of my questions.
Yeah, please.
Okay, so pretty much the examples we've had so far are about moral panics with video games and the written words, and even like the banned booklet. How much of the moral panics throughout history have been influenced by the spread of new ideas?
Almost all of them. I think almost all of them. Because if you go back to that Goldilocks effect, right? That's the thing. It's like, I don't know what those kids are doing, but whatever it is, they don't need it. Right? Whatever it is, they don't need it. Because they only need what I tell them they need. Does that kind of make sense? And so this has been a classic struggle, right? Like, on the one hand, every generation should do better than its predecessor. That's how society grows, right? But on the other hand, at any given time, 2 or 3 or maybe even 4 generations all have to coexist. And there's always that period of time where the folks in charge and their ideas are becoming less popular, but they're still in charge.
Like right now?
Like right now, right? Like, you know, anytime we talk about progressive movements, one irony behind that is all movements are almost inherently progressive. Because we see a trajectory
There's a fire in my building. I have to leave.
You should do this. Just ping us if you need us. I just hope he's not actually suffering, because that could be a very prescient comment to make on the call. There's a fire in my building. I have to leave. So
Like his back. I hope not.
Someone check on Sam here in a couple of minutes. We're laughing now, and I hope it's actually just funny.
Hopefully we hear back from him.
Right.
Use this point to go get another cup of coffee.
No worries. All right. Let's see here. No, Benjamin, I think you're right. I think that's part and parcel of it all, right? It's the status quo sort of broadly defined. And in one of those things we can talk about, you know, the spread of new ideas. I mean, think about how many parents are mad about new math. Like the audacity to teach your kids that numbers are concepts. And parents are furious about this because it's hard. Yes, it's hard because you didn't learn it. Of course it's hard. Now, there are some administrative problems, like maybe teach the parents it before you roll it out to their children, and then kids can't get help from their parents. Like, that's a problem, right? But no, generally speaking, there's been a recognition that students do better with math when they understand number theory. You know, and we say you don't need that. When I was a kid, I did long division. How many of you in school learned how to borrow from a number doing division? How dumb of an idea is that? What the hell are we taught? Oh, you can just borrow from this number. That's not how numbers work. Like, the hell? Like, no. Yes, it got you an answer, but it got you an answer by really dubious and silly ways, right? And Sam pointed out, we learned how to do things in a way that worked, but was tedious and kind of unnecessary. Our kids below us are going to learn how to do math because they understand how numbers work.
No, core math is what's currently being taught.
What's that?
Core math is what's being taught to kids.
Where they're moving now is teaching number theory, and that's what's important. Like, as you get into it, you're going to start realizing over time that the generation coming out of school, they're going to understand numbers better than we do. Because they literally know what numbers look like and what they sound like, the theory underlying them. That you don't borrow from a number to get another number.
Yeah, like with core math, is the idea. Part of it is for a simple addition, there's about 12 steps.
Right, but the argument
person.
the argument is that those steps are number theory. Like that's sort of
Yeah.
the focus. So the debate here is not about math, obviously, but it's
Yeah.
about Benjamin's question that is, yeah, we don't like new ideas. We don't think we need them. I have healthcare and a job. Why are we debating healthcare and a job? Like that's a debate, right? It's like, I don't need these things, you know? Nobody's shooting at me. Why are we debating these things? And new ideas scare people. And this goes back to the beginning of time, right? So, Benjamin, I think you're right. There's a lot. And then not to mention, even if it's not like a hardcore like idea, it's that new ways of thinking and new technologies value some skills over others, right? So when you go to mass production, you no longer value craft work. And that's a threat if you're a craftsperson. So there's even like a cultural embedded idea in there. You know, if you go to this shift over that shift, what's a big one with VR? We no longer value reality. Oh, you just care about pixels and dots and shit on screen. You don't care about going to the national park.
False.
But that's
It's
a
more
debate.
like I don't care about attending class.
What's that?
I said it's more like I don't care about attending class, especially right now. If I'm gonna be on some if I'm living life through screens right now, why not do something that I enjoy and doesn't
Right, but
stress
we're not
me
talking
out?
about COVID. I'm saying one of the concerns about VR is it devalues reality. And this is things people are saying. They're like, all these kids want to be on their screen and they don't want to go outside anymore.
I can actually insert another one of my questions. The one I think I'm more proud of than the rest of them. How will full dive VR or fully immersive VR affect our society? Will it be beneficial or detrimental? Do the pros outweigh the cons?
Well,
And I definitely think full dive VR will cause a moral panic.
I think we can focus on that one. I don't think we can prognosticate on what the effect will be because it's completely speculative, right? I mean, we didn't know what the effect of cars would be, right? And there have been some good things and there have been some bad things, right? The good thing, the world got smaller. We can transport things more readily. We can now see parts of our world we never saw before. The con, we can't breathe very well and the globe's heating up, right? So like these things always go back and forth. And in some ways, there is really never going to be a case where there's a technology that only has benefits and doesn't have effects, right? But the moral panic part, I think we can debate because we can think about what the moral panic would actually be, right? But for that one, I actually want to hold it to slide like set 25 because once we talk about the game debates, I want to say what are the new moral panic debates for VR. Let's do that because I want to actually anchor the back half of our conversation wholly around what Jerry just said. But I want to get through the games ones first, okay? And then we'll go for there. Other panics very quickly. People thought that reading would distract you from your chores. Telephones would threaten privacy. Crossword puzzles would make us illiterate. Again, many of these things weren't inherently wrong, but they were inflated and they didn't recognize the other half of things. You get the point, I think. Let's talk about... Actually, well, a couple more here. How do we identify moral panic? The claims come before the data. That's number one. People start making claims without there being evidence. There tend to be a lot of calls for research, and they come from the public, but that research tends to have a political end to it. It's not are games causing violence, is how much violence do games cause? And of course, what's the difference between those two questions?
Can you say it again?
It's not necessarily do games cause violence, it's how much violence do games cause. And there's a big difference.
The first question questions if video games are even linked to that at all. The second question is leaving an implication that video games do in fact cause it. Now we just need to find out.
Right, you're affirming the consequent, right?
Yeah,
You've already
automatically assuming.
Exactly right. Exactly right. You've already determined it, but you're not actually. So at that point, you're not looking for situations where they don't. As a journal editor, I've often seen manuscripts come in, and one of my critiques has been, did you measure other effects? All you ask for is how violent are they, which is only going to give you one set of answers, from a little bit to a lot. And I'm like, but you didn't ask none. So the data seems skewed here, right? Goldilocks effect, Benjamin already hit. Concern for the children, we all kind of hit. And then we're going to come back to Jared after the game section to kind of kick off the conversation about VR. I guess I went through these too fast. Claims come first. One of the things that was said, like when violent games came out, is that the kids who have done violent things played violent games. And one of the things that my colleague Jimmy Ivory at Virginia Tech said, it's kind of like saying the perpetrator wore shoes. And what do you think he means by that?
Most kids at the time were probably playing video games.
Right. So you're drawing a correlation between one thing that's almost a constant and one thing that varies. And yeah, it'd be like saying, hey, the shooter had shoes on. Yeah, everybody has shoes on. So saying the kid played video games, well, yes, it's one of the most popular pastimes that children engage in. So they probably had video games. They were also in the third grade because all of them were in the third grade, right? You have to be careful with these claims. Calls for research where you already know what you want. I kind of already said that. The Goldilocks effect, which I think, Benjamin, you hit it really well on that one. And this comic's kind of sad, but kind of true. In my day, we had measles, polios, and Nazis, and the little girl's like, I don't want to tell them. Like, we still have these things, right? Concern for the children, we've already kind of talked about. You might recognize this quote, but it's this idea that, like, the kids are these very delicate things, and we can't just let anything get to them. And again, that's not unfair. We should probably protect children when possible, right? But we have to be careful to realize, are we really protecting children? Or are we just using that as a label to say we're protecting something when really what we're protecting is ourselves? To go back to a couple points that were already made. I don't like change. It's just easier for me to convince y'all not to change. Like, I'd love to hear sometime about the library and if you had any resistance to installing VR. Because I've heard other institutions have had to really argue for, like, we don't need those gimmicks around here. Like, we deal in books and knowledge and not crazy, weird technologies, right? And those things come up. In my own research, I'm constantly having to defend how it is that I can study entertainment. I'm actually surprised that I haven't gotten a call from like a state house member yet saying, why are our taxpayers going to pay for you to play Nintendo all the time? And I have answers. So one of them is it's one of the most popular things children do. So if you want to know how it affects them, you got to let me study it, right? And so forth and so on. All right, let's talk. We're going to talk about a couple more past effects, then games, then VR. Does anybody know about the seduction of the innocent studies prior to reading about them? It's one of the more famous examples of a moral panic.
It's fine, but it involved comic books.
Yeah, it was published in the 50s. And in fact, the article you read, does anybody remember where that article came from, where it was published at? Or maybe I didn't give you the Virtue article to read. I thought I did. The article on screen was published in Ladies' Home Journal. How is that relevant to our conversations? So a psychiatrist wrote an article about, and Matt did point out, by the way, that it was a bit of a battle. So Matt, I might tap you later on in the chat when we talk about Jared's panics to see if we can unpack some of that if you're comfortable with it. So a psychiatrist publishes an article about the dangers of comic books, seducing the innocent. And they published that article in Ladies' Home Journal. Walk me through how that connects back to moral panics. Already, before we even analyze it. Go ahead.
They're tapping into this like market of people they know will panic essentially.
They're tapping into
they have I mean, there's at this time most women were stay-at-home moms, so they probably had the time to read this magazine and get with their friends and like form movements of like, let's shut down these video games or the comics, you know.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so the role of the media, right? I mean, you magazines were a bit more popular then, right? And if you were doing the shopping, you might grab a magazine off the rack, and Ladies' Home Journal was certainly a magazine targeted at housewives. So, we're engaging at stereotype to explain some of these things, right? And in this case, yeah, he spoke directly to them. And who are they concerned about?
Their kids.
Their kids. So you've got, and what are their kids doing? Something in youth culture. They're reading weird comics. And they didn't read comics when they were young, but their kids are reading comics. And what do kids do when they're like in middle school age, just broadly?
Fight.
They act up because they're kids and they're going through developmental stages and they start challenging authority, and you start getting to a stage where you realize the world's a bit complicated and social stigmas play a role. And before you know it, like, there's going to be some deviant behavior a child engages in, and you're going to need a reason to explain it. And so this article comes along and says, hey, look what just happened. Alex just shared a video. Which one's that?
It's Principal Skinner when he was going, am I so out of touch?
Oh,
no,
yes.
The children who are wrong.
No, it is the children who are wrong, right? It is the best example of the Goldilocks effect. Am I so out of touch? And it's one of my favorite memes, too. So let's talk about this. So he talks about books being propaganda because they're published and they sit around and you can read them over and over again. They can mold you over time. By the way, the comic on the screen is a real one. This was published by the Republican Party in the a political action committee in the 50s during the McCarthyism era.
Wow.
That's America under communism. Just choke and punch and burn, right? and I believe if you click this link, you can read that original comic. It's a PDF of the whole thing. It's very expensive to purchase it because they didn't survive, ironically. But you should definitely take a look at that. It's an interesting propaganda piece.
I think I can throw in my last question here. I don't know where else I could throw it in. I think I probably could have thrown it in a bit earlier.
No worries.
But why do moral panics tend to blame a thing rather than a person, such as blaming violent video games rather than prior mental illnesses or other factors?
Sure.
In the case of various shootings.
What do you think?
Because sensationalism. And it's much easier to blame something that is easy to get rid of than to blame something like a mental illness, which a lot of people unfortunately still believe is not real, or at the same time, just they don't want to have to pay for that being taken care of. It's much easier to take away something you don't understand than it is to take care of something you don't understand.
It's a parsimony effect, right? Remember, a lot of this is people would be so much better off if this one thing wouldn't have happened, right? So if we just get rid of that one thing, all of our problems will go away. Like I read an article recently that was talking about that men are skipping work to play video games more. And it was a published research article. And one person put back, did you think that maybe just there aren't any jobs right now? that could be it. Like maybe finding a job's tough right now. So you're correlating like the popularity of games with not going to work. And they're like, or we don't have a very strong economy. While the stock market did okay pre-COVID, the jobs rates weren't such that there were just jobs for everybody. It doesn't work that way, right? So they're like, I think you're correlating two things that don't exist. So I think Alex's answer is pretty good. Javier, go ahead.
I mean, did activity on Steam skyrocket?
Well, that's during COVID, sure. Yeah.
They're playing more games because you can't go to work.
There's another reason why they're playing more games, because they're at home. Right?
What am I going to do? I'm stuck here.
So one of the arguments to answer Jared's question is that it's easy to point to a device. It's not that people are wrong. It's that they would all be okay if this one thing would go away. If the technology is what causes the panic, the easy answer is to get rid of the technology, right? That's the debate. And I think that's why time and time again, we see this emergence of this thing is new, things are changing, and we don't recognize change in people nearly as quick as we recognize change in technologies. So I can point to that thing and say, get rid of it. Some
parents would say, in regards to his question, they would think no, my child would never think this way, act this way. So they usually would go to blame something else first. If this is responsible for my child's, downfall or whatever, that can happen.
It's also the easiest solution, right? I mean, the easy solution is just don't buy a Nintendo. I can do that. I can not do things super quick. Throw the
300
comics in the
extra
trash
bucks and my kid is good. What's the problem?
Right, I don't see the issue. So I think that's the answer, Jared. I think it's the tech becomes the threat. And that's exactly, they're one and the same thing, right? It's that the tech becomes the threat. Remember, in Moral Panic, we're not necessarily interested in understanding the problem.
Right.
Like, this is not a rash. When we say the word the term moral panic, it's not meant to be a nice term. It's kind of derogatory. It's a pejorative.
Panic is Latin, and it comes from the Greek god, I think, of Pan, and it's like it means like a feeling of irrepressible and inescapable and alienating fear.
Yeah, panics are not rational. They are, like, by definition, irrational reactions that override sensible thinking, that override solutions orientations. In some ways, moral panics keep me in business because I come at it as a scientist. And then my job is to go, okay, let's see if there's actually an effect. And then we do the research, and then we find out if there is an effect or if there's not an effect. And Jared, more often than not, the answer from research is, there's a little bit of an effect, but the larger effect is mental health, home stability, income. Like, those tend to be the larger effects. And that answer, although it persists time and time again, people don't like it because those are hard things to solve. As Alex said, we don't even take mental health seriously. We barely fund it as it is. My brother's a mental health counselor. He can speak to this directly. He ended up leaving the public sector and going to the private sector because he can make more money. And he was like, this really sucks because I used to work with inner city youth, but we can't keep the clinic open. But I can go out to the suburbs and, kids in Houston whose parents think they smoke too much weed will give me thousands and thousands of dollars to ask them about their feelings. And he's like, it's totally stupid, but it keeps the bills on. And so then they all just do volunteer work on the side. He's like, it's a terrible industry because we don't take it seriously, right? So a long kind of political answer, but the answer is basically the tech is the thing we can see. This widget's the reason. Remember when schools were banning fidget spinners?
Bro, what is that?
Oh, this is the, what's this called?
Cube.
The distraction cube?
Fidget cube.
Yeah, fidget cube. A lot of schools ban these fidget cubes. Because how
Along
dare
with
you...
the fidget spinners and stuff?
Yeah, because, you should just be paying attention. And I'm like, I've been doing this for an hour and a half, folks. And I'm shockingly still paying attention to the conversation. I just have a little bit of difficulty focusing sometimes.
I always have a difficulty focusing. That's why I focus on drinking coffee.
I'm telling you, buy this. Just don't hit the switch one because it makes a lot of noise.
You can get some that are not loud.
I know, that's the hard part. I've used it so much that I've broken it. To where now it makes... This one also is Super Nintendo colors. So, anyway.
Nice.
So he talks... people loved his book when it came out. It's a must-read for parents, teachers, librarians, social workers, all adults concerned with children's reading and with their development. It's a well-named, frightening, convincing, and overpowering argument. The National Education Association named it the Book of the Year. I mean, this guy got a lot of credit. I have a copy of his book, actually, in my comic book collection. Funny enough, because if you're a comic book fan, this guy's like the ultimate villain, right? By the 50s, comics were popular. They were the fraction of the cost of a book, right? And their themes, so like in the 40s, comics were mostly propaganda for the war. Don't you all have probably seen the cover of Captain America punching Hitler in the mouth? I mean, if that's not more iconic of like the war, I mean, guy wears an American flag that's crotch tight and punches Hitler in the face. I mean, pretty much like, all right, cool, I got this. My kids can read this. That's cool. That's great. That's what I want them to learn, Or Superman, Truth, Justice, and the American Way. The number of people, by the way, who forget that Superman's an immigrant is amazing to me. He's not from here.
Crash landed here.
Yeah, well, but that's intentional. Like, the writers didn't just do that because, like, There's a lot of storyline around like to be an American is to be here and contribute and make a way through society. Has anybody ever read Superman Red Sun?
Nobody know it. Like, I understand the concept of that.
Yeah. He crash lands 12 hours earlier, and so he lands in Russia instead. And the whole book is, well, what happened if Superman was a Soviet hero? And it's pretty amazing. But anyway, what I'm getting at is don't be shocked. Going back to Benjamin's comment about like different thoughts. Yeah. Comics have been throwing out subversive, progressive thoughts for a long time.
It's so comics are so progressive, and sometimes people, they're so like the older readers too, like why are there gay superheroes now and stuff like that.
There are always gay superheroes. We just talked about them in different ways. The X-Men the X-Men was largely an allegory for civil rights.
Right, exactly.
I don't know why folks didn't pick up on this. Oh, a group of minorities who cannot control how they look and behave are being prosecuted by the majority? Shocker. If they just would have made 6 black people in tights, it wouldn't have gone over well. It's a metaphor. There's a metaphor. Like, this is not shocking. Now, they could have had a more diverse writing staff, and they could have made their point a little stronger. But that being said, I'm still amazed that people did not realize that the X-Men were basically an allegory for civil rights. And then, of course, in the X-Men movies were about gay rights. And there's a lot in there that's not hidden. It's metaphor. Stories are metaphor. People don't like stories for these reasons, right?
Yeah, people say keep politics out of my comics, dude. It's all politics.
Captain America punched Hitler in the face. Politics have always been in comics. I mean, I just want to repeat that over and over again. I actually have that print at my office.
His name is Captain America.
His name was Captain America. And he was a scrawny guy who wanted to contribute to the war effort. And so they made him a super soldier who was a patriot and he was loyal. Which is why Civil War, by the way, was so amazing because he left. But I got to stop because I will give an entire discussion on comic books and we'll get derailed. But after the war, the themes shifted. They got a little more mature. My dad used to buy all these horror comics. We have a whole box of them downstairs of these just gruesome, grisly horror comics. 90% of kids in the 50s were reading comics. About 80% were teenagers. And comics were for them. And that's the point here. It was the kids doing it. So they were called the marijuana of the nursery. Shallow and immature, children's material. They were junk. Stan Lee changed his name because he was embarrassed to write comic books. He didn't want to embarrass the Lieber family, so he changed his name. Of course, Stan Lee wrote one of the very first Captain America stories, and then eventually went on to help create the character and go through these things. And of course, in these comic books, we saw some crazy stuff. So like Bertram was terrified that kids were seeing all of these images. Boot to the face, a man smacking his wife, sex and blood, like revealing imagery, like this guy spanking a woman. And like, let's be clear, these are kind of weird. Like, I don't know if I want my 13-year-old reading spanking comics, right? Now, one of the things that was happening here is how representative do you think these comics were of all comics?
I don't know. Obviously, if it's in one thing, it affects the whole group.
But it's probably an exemplar, right? Like, sort of like when you read about violent video games, what games do they bring up?
Mortal Kombat, Call of Duty.
And, well, Call of Duty is very popular, don't get me wrong. Every game's not Call of Duty. Every game is not Mortal Kombat. When I was younger, it was Carmageddon. Has anybody ever played Carmageddon?
I think I have.
It's crazy. And I think you can get it under Good Old Game, GOG.com. It's an old DOS game where it's basically destruction derby with people on the road. You can run over them and smash them and they bleed everywhere. But it wasn't a very popular game. It was kind of underground, but it was there. A lot of the go ahead.
I think I might be able to kind of fit in one of my questions here. So we're talking about how like when they show these, when someone's trying to show how bad comics or video games can be, they're showing like the worst of the worst to people that don't know that much about it.
Yeah.
So I was wondering, like, if would more exposure show these people like the other side of them, or even the fact that, or like the cathartic nature of them, versus the fact that they influence you to do things. It's more like they give you the ability to do things that you knowingly wouldn't do in real life. Or do you think they would go the opposite direction and like be like, well, this is even more violent than I thought it was, if they like pick up Doom, you know, and they're like, you know, so I guess what do we think about that?
Yeah, what do y'all think about that? I'm going to pull something up while you're talking about this.
I think like more exposure might help them see it. The problem is they're not really looking for more exposure. They're looking for specific examples to prove their point.
True.
It might just be back and forth, right? Well, here's my anecdote. Here's your anecdote. We have an article coming out in the Frontiers in Communication where we talk about this. I just shared the abstract with you. The article will be posted in a couple of days. We have to pay the invoice for the open access fee. Even science is still an economy. And we wrote a manuscript about the paradox of interactive media. And the claim is that you could actually use violence in video games and VR in violence prevention. And that's actually our entire argument. I don't know how it's going to be received. I am very curious. One of our co-authors is with the CDC, and they did sign off on the research, so we do have some credibility here. We don't have any data. It's all speculative. It's argumentation. But our argument is essentially this article was written for clinicians and researchers to read and go, maybe this stuff could actually be good. I don't know how it's going to be received. So ask that question in a month.
I can give an example.
What's that?
I can give like kind of an example of this exposure argument.
Mm-hmm.
Like, so there's a director by the name of Michelle Haneke who made a film called Funny Games, which is a very violent, sadistic film about basically a family being tortured in their home by two young men. But what the goal of the film was is not to make you like violence. Is to make it's basically the whole point of the film was like the view on violence in the media and how much should we tolerate it, you know, and like because like the criminals, like bad people in the film, break the fourth wall at times, turn to the audience to say like, you're enjoying this, aren't you? Like you're enjoying this violence and stuff. Like it's very. So that's an example of like a film that has a bunch of bad stuff in it, but the purpose of it was not to make you, it's not pro-violence. It was to basically question whether like this should be in the media today at this extent, and should we allow it?
Sure.
So.
Matt brings up an interesting point about games. Like, has anyone played the Goose Game yet? Untitled Goose Game? You know, it's a fun, playful game. But of course, he's like, people could also say you're just anthropomorphizing torture, because this goose is basically a torture device, and the fun of the game is essentially tendentious humor, right? Because the whole time you as a goose are making life horrible for these humans. So on the one level, you have to remember that moral panics aren't rational. So the fighting fire with fire thing just results in two fires, right? On the other hand, we know that media are maturing. So like what Javier is talking about. And films have featured violence for a long time. Schindler's List. It's one of the most violent films you'll ever watch. But I don't think that Steven Spielberg was like, yeah, this is an action movie, right? It was, this is how bad things were. Or has anybody ever seen the Bully movie? Where they followed a kid around in a day and he was bullied all day.
I think I've seen part of it.
It was a documentary on bullying in schools. Guess the irony behind that movie when it was released. What rating did it get?
Was it low?
It got a rating R, which means who can't watch it now?
Kids.
The whole film was to expose bullying for what it is and what it looks like and how dangerous it is and how it hurts people and how they carry it home with them and they feel bad and they cry and they wouldn't screen it for kids because it was rated R. And people are like, you know, so there's an irony where, yes, I think you're right. You could make the argument that this stuff has good effects, it's going to be an uphill battle, right? It's going to be an uphill battle because people aren't necessarily wanting to hear that, right? What I want to hear is this stuff is bad. Now, later on in the lecture, we're going to talk about how things are maturing and that it's starting to change a little bit. But possibly, you know. Or one argument could just be, okay, great, it's good, it's still bad, right? Remember, our cognitive heuristics are going to kick in, and we're just going to see that as an attack. If you ever heard of the hostile media bias, it's when we read an article that's objective, but it mentions things that go against our worldview, and so we automatically assume the article is attacking us, even before it actually is. You know, feedback can be seen as hostile, even when that feedback's not hostile. So it's a good question to ask, Riley. That's all you can do, right? It's better than nothing. It probably just gets more things into the media sphere, but it doesn't address it overnight, right? But you also can't not do that. Well, these comics were largely known to been taken from kind of fringe publications, okay? But they weren't good. I mean, this is not good content for children. Wife beating, spanking, boobs, vampires, face crushing, bullets to the forehead. Probably not great. Now, of course, Grand Theft Auto, who's the target audience for that game?
Adults.
Adults. It's rated that way. It's satirical, right? It's not mid for 13-year-olds. You know, we can
I
talk.
don't think we give kids enough credit, honestly.
What do you say?
Like, I don't think we give kids enough credit, like, because how many kids at home, especially in the 50s, are seeing their father beat their mothers?
Well,
Like,
remember, Riley, it's not about being rational. That's my point. Like, this is not like, oh, we rationally decided these things are bad. It's, oh, look at these terrible things. And it's the Goldilocks effect. You're not wrong, of course. And in fact, part of our argument in our paper is kids aren't stupid. Like, they understand subtlety and context, and you can figure these things out. I mean, VeggieTales is every bit as an allegory for religion as this comic is for beating your wife. Like, there's subtlety in these texts. But the issue is that when you them somebody, you are taking away their credit, aren't you? You're saying them are deviant and them need fixing. And only I can fix them. Does that kind of make sense?
Yeah.
So you're definitely not wrong, but that is sort of part and parcel of the issue, right? It's that, no, we're not giving them credit. I don't know, maybe rockers just like riding motorcycles and that's cool, right? But they are in need of help from us because we're the ones that do it right and they're the ones that do it wrong.
I mean, also, if we look like historically, several civilizations, you know, you were an adult when you were 15 rather than what now it's about 17, 18, 21 or whatever.
Yep. Of course, there is a pushback on that one because we're seeing a big debate at university where because a lot of children or a lot of kids are not allowed to grow up, that they get to college and they still can't make decisions because the parents like do not let you make decisions for yourself. So there's almost been like a suppression effect where we do not let you mature in age. And that's been an interesting discussion to have with faculty around like seeing students who like can't make decisions. That wasn't an issue 20 years ago because people have aged slower now. So you're right. You're right on both ways, right? On the one hand, we forced you to be an adult earlier. And now some folks are wondering if we're not letting you be an adult earlier. Think about some of the rules around student life you and I have talked about with the organizations. I'm like, why are we holding your hand? Just go do this. Oh, you have a group. You're the president of that group. Maybe you just skin your knees and then your advisors goes, what did you learn, Jared? And you're like, don't give VR to dogs. I'm like, all right, don't give VR to dogs. Right?
What about the studies with like the VR and cows?
Yeah, actually, I love that one. I think that's Grace's research. The VR and cows. So anyway, they showed the comics were bad. There were these clinical interviews where kids would like talk about the content and they liked it and they wanted to redo it. I like the one where the man puts the needle in the woman's eye. Where is this kid at?
In juvie.
In juvie. Why is that important for this conversation? Going back to Riley, and I think maybe a couple other folks have brought this up before already, including you, Jared.
Context matters.
And what would be the context of interviewing a kid in juvenile hall who says, I like it in the comic where the guy stabs the lady with a needle.
That's like
Obviously, if they're in juvie, they're not exactly a very good person, probably.
Potentially. I mean, we definitely have to be careful about incarceration rates, but generally speaking, if they are in a juvenile detention hall and diagnosed as psychotic, which was the case in this particular study, what would be the alternative explanation for why this kid likes this panel?
Because they like hurting people.
Because they like hurting people. And that may not have come from the comic books they read. It may be biological or neurological in order. Or it may need some counseling and training. Frederick Bertram was a psychiatrist. So his patients were all under his care as a psychiatrist. And something that got lost in a lot of these conversations was he kept saying, I have all these kids in juvenile hall who are psychotic and they love comic books. Therefore, comic books are injurious to children. Do you see what the logical flaw in that argument is? It could be that your children are diagnosed. They need treatment. That they may already see the world this way, which is why they're picking up the comics to begin with. Right? To go back to Jared's point, though, that's a harder explanation. What he saw, and look, he probably was really concerned. If you're a psychiatrist and all of your patients keep saying, I like it in comics when people stab each other in the eyeball, that's terrifying. And so one solution is get rid of the comic books. Now, maybe it should have been get rid of the comic books for the children who are in psychiatric care, not for everybody. But then again, the question becomes, is it going to hurt anybody if they don't see these comics anymore? And that's where moral panics start to kick up. And we can talk about that too, because I think there are some things that it hurt. There are also a lot of things like there was this underlying theme of like this fear of homosexuality. Like comics were displaying homosexual tendencies, and this got brought up a lot in Bertram's book. And if you think about the time frame here, some people wonder if he was playing on other cultural fears of deviancy. Again, I am not saying this is deviant behavior, but it's how it was framed. Well, it's framed that way today, but it was definitely framed that way in the middle 20th century, right? And as Avery pointed out, mental health is probably the issue here. So later on in life, later on in research, a woman named Carol Tilley did some research on Bertram's work and generally found that he's pretty sure that this research, or she's pretty sure his research was bull. That a lot of it was driven more by a desire to find a reason why kids were psychiatric care.
Psychotic.
Yeah, than actually comics were hurting people. But his research led to the Comics Code, which existed until the 2000s. The industry suffered. Companies went out of business. Later on in life, people talked about the role of comics and imagination. But we stopped writing serious comic themes because you couldn't sell them anywhere. And so some folks think that like what we're seeing right now in comics, this like golden age of storytelling, would have probably happened 70 years ago if we would have been allowed to talk about these things. Gaming now. Death Race. Anybody played this game before? I'm just curious.
What can you play it on? Is it an arcade machine?
It's an arcade game. I'm guessing, Alex, either arcade or probably emulator.
There's this website that has this huge backlog of all these different games that you can play from way back when. So I was just browsing and I saw this game that said Death Race, and I was like, okay,
that could be fun. It's about racing to death. And the original Riley, you would have played it in a machine with a steering wheel and a pedal.
Oh, okay.
And you would have run over these little gremlins. You went over them, they scream a little bit. They don't really scream, the game makes like a noise, and then a headstone pops up. And it's pretty weird. It's based on a movie that came out at the same time called Death Race 2000, which the entire film is on YouTube, and you should watch it. David Carradine stars in this film where once a year they let these criminals race across the country for their freedom. And as part of the race, they get bonus points for murdering people. And they get bonus points for murdering the elderly, the sick, children. Why they get bonus points for killing those kind of people?
because they're a burden to society.
Yeah, they cost too much. So like the hospitals on the death race day take all their patients and wheel them out into the street and like make them stand in the interstate while the racers come by and run them over.
That's so dystopian.
And the whole film, if you watch it, it's a dystopian science fiction. You know, it's in the future where corporations own the country and profits over people. We death race and get rid of the chaff. And Frankenstein finally takes the whole thing down. The main character's name's Frankenstein because he's been in so many accidents. He's been sewn back together so many times.
Gross.
That's David Carradine's character. And of course, the game was kind of an unofficial version of that. People were not happy. This was considered the first murder simulator. And in the earliest days of Moral Panic, this is the game that kicked it off. Most historians kind of generally agree that this was the game that cemented violence with video games. And a lot of
chess seems pretty violent to me.
So the irony behind what you just said is when I talk about these things publicly, when I give lectures, I often bring up chess and I say, imagine what would happen if all of your pawns had names and backstories and families on the side cheering for them. Would you play chess differently, right? Because most of us who play chess, you don't care about all but like one piece, right? Which is an analogy for war. I mean, chess is brilliant in ways beyond just the board itself, right? There's a certain, other associations you can draw there.
I mean, if you give the pawns and all of them backstories and names, you're playing Fire Emblem at that point.
You're basically playing Fire Emblem at that point. You're still going to let them die. It's just that, like, you'll feel a little sad when it happens. Or not.
Oh, I don't like letting any of them die.
Or I want to play chess, but nobody can die. And, of course, you can't do that in war. That's where this gets complicated. And what's funny about what you brought up, Jared, is that that's kind of getting what Riley was talking about. Like, if you showed, like, what you could learn by doing this, it would be a very different experience. And we're actually going to go there in a couple of slides. I think all this is going to kind of coalesce at the end. So the murder simulator, and a part of it was like you're holding a steering wheel, you've got a pedal, so like you could do this in real life, right? This game fired it up. We go from Death Race. Those portrayals have evolved over the years. Great article by Carly Karosek, if you ever want to read it. It's on Exidy and Death Race and like the start of Moral Panic. It's open access online. It's called like the, I forget the name. If you type in Death Race Karosek 2012, you'll get the article from Game Studies. So we go from the 70s to Mortal Monday, where you reach into somebody's chest cavity, pull out their still beating heart, take a bite out of it and hold it in the air. And Kano wins. And I don't know if anyone's played Mortal Kombat, but do you know what was special about the development of that game compared to other games at the time?
They were using... They took pictures, and it was basically just a mixture of real-life pictures placed in motion.
The graphics were all 16-bit renderings of photorealistic actors, and it was pretty wild at the time, admittedly. Like, it was the first time that they weren't animated. Like, Street Fighter is animated, and it's even gotten more animated over time, right? And Mortal Kombat was always, like, the real game, because they had motion capture movements, 16-bit versions of real footage. Now, obviously, the footage of the heart being ripped out wasn't real, but you get the point. Anybody play the game on the far right?
Is that Manhunt?
That's Manhunt, which I don't believe did very well compared to other Rockstar games, like sales figures.
It got an adults-only rating, so
got an AO rating.
Wasn't sold anywhere.
And if you remember Manhunt, I have both of them over there, actually. The very first game, you wake up, you're in a prison, right? And it's like a reality show, basically, and you're promised your freedom if you do things on camera, right? And you're walking around, and there's like these... Because if I remember, they let everybody out of the asylum. And your job is to basically survive and get out. And you see someone walking by, and you don't have any weapons, but there's a plastic bag on the ground. And you can pick it up, sneak up behind the person, put the bag over their head, tie it behind them, and then choke them out. And in the video game, they had to program it to censor out. So what happened whenever you execute somebody is it would go to the camera footage that was being recorded by the mysterious Overwatcher, and it would show the murder live. But if you remember, if you played Manhunt, it would always go to static at the gruesome part. But there was a hack where you could program out the static. And we had the hack at Michigan State because we were doing a study on violence where all the developers did it was super clever. They just put in a line of code and you could put into your PlayStation, there was like a memory card device that would render your games differently and it would block that line of code and you could see the violence and all of its gruesomeness. And that game got a lot of heat. These are all different kinds of murder simulators. The portrayals are evolving. They're getting more graphic. They're getting more serious. You're seeing more blood. You're actually doing the violence. Manhunt was on the Wii, so you could actually stab people like with your Wii controller, and then it would stab them in the video game. I remember when you would garrote people, you would actually like choke people out in your living room, and then they would die, right? It's a pretty intense game. Actually, as a stealth game, and Alex, maybe you have a different opinion, it's kind of a fun game to play. Like, it's one of the better stealth games I've played because you're so squishy. Like, you get killed virtually by nothing, which makes this game so much harder to play, right? Because literally, like, you can't just go in and, like, hit people. They will take you out. I liked it. It was a fun game. It was a very hard game. And in ways, like, the murders in that game and the murders in Mortal Kombat, what was their role in the gameplay? Spectacle. And and spectacle rewarding what?
A hard challenge.
So in Mortal Kombat, what do you have to do to tear someone's heart out?
You have to commit a fatality, which requires you to put in specific button inputs.
Yeah, I remember, like, at that time, you couldn't just go online and pull them up, right? You had to learn them. There were some strategy guides that would come out, and so some of us would, like, go to like the bookstore at the mall and we'd sit in the back and like, you know, bring a piece of paper and write down all the codes or the fatality moves. And then like when the manager came by, we'd run away. It was so funny seeing like the Mortal Kombat strategy guide that was for sale brand new. And it was all bent up and like thumbprints all over it and like snow cone juice because it was probably 300 kids that read that thing, wrote their stuff down and then like disappeared. Right. Manhunt 2, again, yeah, it was, you know, you could just kill people by punching them. Or like if you had a baseball, you could hit him with a baseball bat. But if you were really good and you did the right move at the right time with the right timing and the right space, you would get this like glorified murder. And it was meant to be kind of an Easter egg, right? Which I point that out because if you're a gamer, what might be your motivation for doing these things?
To show people that you're better than them.
Talent,
because you have skill, and they don't.
Exactly. I can tell you in the arcade, if you knew the fatalities, you were the coolest kid in town. Like if you were standing there and you'd off somebody and then you'd like tear their skull out, the whole room was like, "Whoa, what just happened?" You're like, "That's a fatality." In fact, in the later games, there were babalities where you turn them into a baby, or there were friendships. You ever see those? Where you would like Google Mortal Kombat friendships. They're pretty funny. There's one where like you bake your opponent a cake and give it to him. Or like one of them, I think it's Johnny Cage, cuts paper dolls out of you and just like does this. And then the word friendship comes up and it's all a bunch of balloons. So there were friendships, babalities, fatalities, all sorts of goofy like, because they were meant to be Easter eggs, right? It was a bunch of developers having a good time. But let's not be animalities. Matt, thank you. I forgot about those. Oh man, yeah, there were some cool ones. I think friendships are my favorite. I'm so glad he brought that up. And you can YouTube these; they're everywhere. Now, but we can't deny it got gruesome. It got weird. Okay, it got violent. Manhunt. If you haven't played it, and Alex, I don't know. There were some times where I did something in that game, and I was like, ugh. That was intense.
Anything involving eyes, I just can't.
Yeah, there was like the ice pick thing, and that would always like, okay, I'm good. Like, I'm not using ice pick weapons anymore. I'm gonna stick to the bat or the bag or like crushing. Crushing's okay. Ice pick's not okay. The sword was somehow okay because I'd seen that before, right? We've kind of already talked about this in class, but as the content evolved from below the neck, the action orientations, punching, kicking, stabbing, video games evolved to be the above the neck verbs. Thinking, contemplating, decision making. This is going to play a role in what Ryo was asking earlier, and it's also going to fold into some of Jared's bits. So quickly, I think I showed, did I show this in class already? The evolution of media? Maybe I didn't. I'll give it very quickly. Media evolve. Oh, Sam is back, by the way, and is not on fire. So good on you, Sam. Well, I shouldn't have assumed that. He is back. I didn't ask if he was okay. The earliest films were just horses running. Moiber just trying to settle a bet that when horses run, do their feet leave the ground or not? And he showed that, yes, they do. And then we started recording things on stage. And there was like a vaudeville play, and you record things in front of it. And you used one camera. Just the audience member, but you caught it on camera. And then we learned that you could like splice movie images into each other and tell different stories. And like when we learned how to do this, film fundamentally changes a medium. Multiple cameras, multiple edits. That's a different thing. My point is, if you would have asked people, having watched this horse running, if film would be a serious narrative device, they would have laughed at you. They're like, no, that's dumb. No one's ever going to take films and tell stories with them.
Yeah, because the thing is, in the early days of film, it was more for spectacle.
Yes.
They put it in like the, like George Méliès was a magician who was interested because he thought it was like magnificent to watch.
Exactly. Think about the early video games. It was the exact same way. Oh, sorry. The earliest games were just computer scientists showing off video games. It was just it was a spectacle. Can we tax these computers? And so the earliest game, Space War, you can play it online too. It's just two spaceships going around a star well. And they were just showing off a computer. They're like, look what computers can do. And then we just, told the same stories over and over again, but just told them with video games. So the princess is in another castle. The princess is in another castle. The princess is in another castle. Right? And then we got to like making moral decisions to where I can choose to harvest or execute children or harvest or rescue children. And now you're involved in the storytelling, that maybe video games situate the player as a co-author, and it changes how we think about things. And all of that's relevant because now you can't just argue that the violence is on screen. It's part of how you're seeing things. Quickly speaking, and some of these slides are from a presentation I gave at a health conference on Tuesday. Are there violent effects? Yes. We cannot pretend that violent media do not have effects. That would not be fair. There are. They're just not very strong. They're just not very strong. These are effect sizes. It's the percentage of variance in a thing explained by another thing. The strongest effects we've ever seen in violent research are in laboratory studies where we show people violence and then measure how aggressive they're feeling afterwards. And we can explain about 25% of their aggressiveness by the violence they just saw. If you look at like longitudinal studies, like behaviors over time, the effects get even smaller. Criminal behavior, we never see effects. There are no effects of violent gaming and TV on criminal behavior. And there's some evidence of what's called publication bias. So what often happens in research, and Lindsay and Phil could tell you about this more, is that scientific manuscripts that have significant effects are more likely to get published than manuscripts that don't have effects. Over time, it gives people the impression that there's lots and lots of evidence for something. Does that kind of make sense? Because the studies that didn't find an effect don't get published. Because they're not considered as interesting. Because why would you publish no effects? And that's changing over time. We're now seeing scientists discuss that, there's no such thing as no effects, right? Finding null effects is as important as finding actual effects. So if you make a prediction that something's going to happen and that thing doesn't happen, that's still valuable knowledge. Why?
Because now you know that thing won't happen.
Right. So in a lot of drug research, we see plenty of publications where, sorry, it's driving me nuts, where there's no effect, and it's important to know that. Interesting thing with video games, the effects are not any stronger. There is always this assumption that if you're doing murder simulations, you're going to be affected by it. And the research is showing almost the exact same effects. And in some cases, they're even smaller. And that's weird. You would think doing something is going to have a stronger effect than watching it. But the reason it's not weird, I'm going to give you a couple examples of data points. Again, these are from that presentation on Tuesday, so the formatting's a little off. We know, for example, that when video gamers play, they don't just turn off their morality when they turn on the PlayStation. Because you can't. Your morality is deeply ingrained in you. Now, if you're playing a game where you get rewarded for shooting things, you're going to shoot things because you're being rewarded and you're not seeing it as a shooting, you're seeing it as a video game. But if you're playing a game that's asking you to make decisions based on who you are, you're going to make decisions based on who you are. We don't turn off our moral codes. In our own research that was published in the journals you see on screen, what we found over and over again is that the more salient a particular moral idea was to you, so let's say you're somebody that doesn't really like harming people. In the video game, if you were walking around and you had the opportunity to hurt people, you were less likely to do it. Less than chance. Like, we could predict the likelihood of you behaving morally based on how you see the world. We've seen people talk about, having problems with torture in video games. Alex, I talked about it a little bit. This is a quote from a player in a very famous scene in World of Warcraft where you torture somebody else. Keeping in mind that Warcraft's not that violent in terms of its portrayals. It's pretty cartoonish and you don't see that much, right? And the person talked about, I just couldn't do it because my character would not torture somebody. So I'm not going to do it either because my character's a wholesome person and things like this. So lots of research on this connection between how you see the real world, quote unquote, and how you see the digital world. And this whole idea of the magic circle doesn't quite work. We don't just step in there and suspend all reality. We can suspend some reality, but we can't change who we are. And so there's evidence suggesting that in many scenarios, we behave the same way in both environments. When we do bad things in video games, sometimes we feel really bad about it. So this is from, you may recognize this scene from Call of Duty Modern Warfare 2, the No Russians level.
Yes. Folks
popped in there and were not happy about it. People went on Reddit and just debated this one. Lindsay and Phil just wrapped up some early coding of people's discussions of this, and Lindsay is actually doing the full analysis. Lindsay, how many forums are you coding?
We have over 700 relevant forums.
These are Reddit users who went on Reddit and just talking about this level. And what are you seeing in terms of this moral debate or discussion about violence? I know the analysis isn't done yet, obviously. And Phil, you can jump in too, but what are you seeing?
Well, what I thought was interesting is that these posts are fairly recent. They're not when the game came out. So a lot of the posts are from 2, 3, maybe 4 years ago.
They're still talking about it years later.
They're still talking about it. Yeah. Still talking about it.
Yeah. Lindsay, what are you seeing out there? And again, I know you're still in the middle of this.
Yeah, well, same thing. Surprised that these are fairly recent posts. I'm surprised that there are a handful of posts where people are talking about in some way altering the No Russians level. So as to avoid the massacre. That's something that I wasn't expecting.
And did you see people talking about it as a bad thing? I just did this thing and what the hell was that?
Yeah, so it's pretty divided, and I think Phil can talk about this too. It's either a lot of people saying that they felt wrong and they felt bad, and then on the other side of the coin you have people saying everyone else should feel dumb for thinking that they should feel bad about playing the level, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it does, because they're changing the calculus. For some people, they're saying, and of course, why do you think the developers made this level?
Yeah, and you have some people saying this is the real Call of Duty. I miss Call of Duty when they had these storylines and these things in there.
Controversies
and it goes to what the developers wanted. The developers wanted people to feel something other than I'm going to shoot what's on screen.
Yeah, it was, and of course, we could debate how well it was done. A lot of folks think it was just kind of clumsy. I know one critique was it was a bit forced. You could not do it, and it didn't really advance the story in any meaningful way. But this is 2012, right? At the time, they were like, we've never really tried like making the player feel shitty about themselves in a shooting game where all you do is shoot things. And then suddenly you shot the wrong thing and now you feel bad about it. And the developers are like, yeah, that's kind of like
Modern Warfare 2 was 2009.
2009, so it goes back even further. You know, like this has been around. That was 11 years ago. And didn't you say, I think, Lindsay, that the new one, they did take it out of the level out entirely when they relaunched it? Was that right?
I'm not sure if they took the level out entirely, but there's a lot of discussion about that, about people worried with the remaster, if it's even going to have that level or not.
Right, because in the original one, they patched it, if I'm not mistaken, or you could skip the level. And you could just.
And the new one, I think it started with the option of not doing it. Like it wasn't a patch, it was just there.
Okay, that makes sense.
But a lot of people talk about how the level wasn't in the original in certain countries,
yes.
Which is interesting to think about.
Yeah, politically, some countries are like, absolutely not. And of course, why are we talking about this? It gets back to some points that were made in the chat earlier, that the fact that players are debating this suggests that media violence effects aren't just you'll be violent. That maybe you will talk about it and debate it and discuss it and wonder what's going on. I think one of the codes Lindsay found is people like, does the CIA really do that? Like, is this really a thing that happens? You know, and those might be interesting to think about as you move forward. Matt's talking about playing, you know, making a choice in Tyranny where, you know, you had to be the evil protagonist, and after you do it, you feel guilty. And maybe guilt's a strong word, but I think players do. Has anybody here played a game where you felt like guilty afterwards? Not just like crying in your room guilty, but like you felt a little weird after playing?
Sometimes. I use the term gross.
Okay, yeah, that was gross. That was not pleasant. Right? Anybody got specific examples?
When I was a kid, I had really big, or I felt a lot of guilt whenever I was playing Pokemon because I always wanted the cutest Pokemon on my team, and I would feel guilty. I know that this is very, very different, not a lot of violence, but I felt very, very guilty whenever I would leave a Pokemon, make it leave my party so I could have a cuter one.
I had a similar thing, not for cuteness reasons, but I had a hard time letting Pokemon go. Because I was like, I just caught you, yo. Like, let's go hang out. And they're like, I'm leaving now. I'm like, no, we should chill out. We should hang out. I also like animals. Like, I like animals a lot. I go to Prairie Dog Town and feed grapes to the prairie dogs all the time. Like, this is what I do. We have mice in our house because it's a freaking old house. I have a live trap where I catch them alive. We use granola, by the way, which works really well. I'm such a hippie. I use granola to bait mice, to catch them in a cage, and then we drive them out to McKenzie Park in the Jeep. I throw it in four-wheel drive. I drive up into the woods, and then let the mice out. There's probably mice colonies now fighting the prairie dogs up in McKenzie Park. Now, part of it, admittedly, it's an excuse to put the Jeep in four-wheel drive. So, like, I have to admit that a little bit I was like, oh, darn, I got to go take the Jeep off-roading today. Let me get the mice up, and I'll be back in an hour. It's like a mile away from my house, but, you know, it takes an hour. So these are kind of wild effects, right? Like, hey, actually, people do ponder what they do in video games. It's not just about the violence. Going a little further, there's spaces for emotions beyond aggression. Appreciation, meaningfulness. Games have gotten more serious is kind of the point I'm trying to make with this. And in those portrayals becoming more serious, we can start thinking about players' reactions being more than just aggression. And I would have had you read the Frontiers article if it was ready yet, but it wasn't. Unfortunately, it wasn't quite ready yet. We're still doing some final edits on that one. All right. And we have, and actually, if this stuff interests anybody, a lot of my lab, again, when we're able to do research again, a lot of my research, so these are mostly papers I've published as teamwork, and they all focus on this idea of taking something away that's more than just aggression. Again, it's not denying the fact that people can get upset. It's just that there's more to it than that. Like Ahave was saying with the film, where the antagonist turns to you and asks you, "You're enjoying this, right?" Like those kind of things. And we're seeing more of that in video games. And more importantly, we're seeing it done in ways that aren't so ham-fisted anymore, where it's not like kick a baby or be a hero. We're starting to see things that are a little more subtle and a little more, they're meant to make you think. Many of you mentioned Spec Ops: The Line in the conversation, and I thought that was awesome because that's the example I use in a lot of my research. And I should have brought the video in for class. I guess I didn't. Oh darn, I forgot the video. The white phosphorus scene, right? Mm-hmm. Where your character decides to drop a white phosphorus canister on what you think are enemy troops. And if you remember that scene, the people you drop it on don't die; they burn to death, and many of them are still alive when you're walking through the battlefield after the event. And why do you think developers would simulate chemical warfare in a video game? What do you got?
Show the horrors of war.
Yeah, I mean, it's just like, hey, man, everybody has these opinions about war. Here's what it's like. So Walt Williams is the writer of that game, and he and I have formed a bit of a friendship as we talk about his game a lot in my classes. But yeah, it was to make you think. Like, here's what it's like. Jared and the other VR group, maybe you can find this online. There's supposed to be a waterboarding simulator for VR.
Well, that sounds pleasant.
So why do you think they would make that?
So you can empathize with people that are getting waterboarded, I assume?
Yeah, a little bit.
I mean,
like, I'm never going to get waterboarded in real life. So if I want to know what it's like, I can do it in VR.
Yeah, Jared, what do you got?
I mean, I know, as you know, Gen Z, as a Zoomer myself, a lot of the time, we joke about pretty serious stuff, and sometimes we don't even know what it is, but it's kind of the way I've seen a lot of our generation cope. And I remember, through the years, I mean, I've heard people joke about, waterboarding, and I don't think any of us really knew what it meant.
That was kind of the idea behind the development. And that's a really good analysis, by the way, of one generation. But I could also point to another generation, and it's the ones above me, who think that torture is how you should treat your enemies. And like, you'll get good information out of them. Well, it's easy to say that when you don't know what torture is. Like, torture is an abstract concept. And we see movies where, like, you get tortured and then people give information, right? But we know from research that it doesn't work, that more often than not, you're getting false information. Because why is the person giving you information?
Because they want the pain to stop.
They want you to stop it. So they will tell you whatever you want to know. Whether it's actually accurate or not is irrelevant. And we know that if you know that I think I'm telling the truth, you won't torture me anymore. Like, there's a lot of research on this. It doesn't work in the way it works in Rambo, right? So for both of these generations, maybe these simulators could be a safe way to know what this thing is, to form a real opinion on it. And of course, that's a big thing in VR, right? Is we can simulate things that we could not ethically or realistically do in reality. And one of those could be waterboarding. So like, yeah, there's probably more than one simulator out there, but there used to be one that traveled the country, and they would have people like try out the simulator, and then they would interview them about waterboarding and about the experience afterwards.
Something kind of similar. Have any of you ever been scuba diving before?
Yes.
Yeah, because when I've done like Subnautica VR or other VR experiences with very like well done water and the sounds, I find myself going into the scuba dive, constant breathing.
Interesting, because it's triggering all of those mental models, right? In your mind, this particular set of stimuli result in a particular set of behaviors. And
I haven't scuba diving in years either.
That's well, and it just becomes so ingrained, right? And we know that people largely approach virtual environments as if they were real. Because we don't really distinguish between the two. It makes perfect sense that would happen. That's pretty interesting.
Which I think will be interesting with the waterboarding simulator. But even with just the right sounds and visuals, you can start triggering responses in people.
That's sort of what was the idea behind it. And so they got heavily criticized for making the game, and they were like, well, A, it's not a game, and B, the point is political. It's like, you keep saying this thing should be cool, why don't you try it for yourself? and let's see what happens, right? And you're seeing a lot of VR and gaming go in that direction. There is a game called Camp Buka that I think was never actually made, where it was a simulation of running Camp Buka in the Middle East during the Afghan incursion, and the political message under it. You know, you may know this political theory that a lot of ISIS's rise to power may have come from the initial U.S. invasions and then incarcerations of people that radicalized them, because you put a bunch of people who are radicals in one room together and you tortured them for years. So it's one political theory. And the point of this game was to try to basically teach that. Like, here's how complicated terrorism is and radical terrorism is, and here's the socio-political things that result in that. Or who here has played Papers, Please?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, where you're a border agent and you have to decide who comes in the country or not. And you're seeing more of those type of both games and simulations. Real quick, I know you all read the Ferguson and Markey paper. I will tell you to read that paper with a grain of salt. I think there are times where they are not very upfront about their positions. Or rather, they have a very clear position, but I think they oversell the idea that games have never had a danger ever. And I give one example. They say that the only reason we study video games today is because of Columbine, because there was the Columbine shooting in Colorado in '99, and then you had this massive increase in video game studies on violence. Could there be another reason why after 1999 we studied more violent video games?
Because video games became more realistic and more popular.
Because video games became more realistic and more popular in the late 90s. I always thought that claim of theirs was a bit dubious. Because I'm like, in the 90s, you had Mortal Kombat, you had Doom. That was pretty much it. Like, most games weren't... The GIF on screen is the evolution of Doom over time, right? And games like Call of Duty and Halo, they didn't exist yet, for the most part. So it's just an example where I'm like, take their arguments with a bit of a grain of salt, because I don't think they're being very objective. Because, yeah, I don't know if Columbine is the reason we studied video games. I think it was because games became more violent at that time, right? I can tell you as a gaming scholar, it's not like there was a whole bunch of funny that came out right afterwards. All right. Oh, that's a not useful slide. All right. Let's talk about VR with this last time, and we're going to bring Jarrett's comments back in here on this one. So, moral panics in VR, right? Let me give a couple, and then Jarrett, I want to have you just kind of push the envelope on some of these conversations, okay?
This one's weird. The one on screen.
The way you're describing it already, this is an example of moral panic, right? Like the idea of, are human bodies useless? Jarrett, can you describe this one to us?
If I'm not mistaken, this is the one where there were these people who used clips and family photos and family videos of this woman's daughter who died fairly early. They recreated her in VR, and I think they
brought her back.
Had a voice actor say things and brought her back, and
yeah. Well, if you can simulate anything, you can simulate anything, right? I mean,
we should simulate anything, though.
Well, this is the classic moral panic discussion. It's the who's the us and who's the them. What's the deviance? What's the effect? What's the issue? It gets tricky. Like, we can have a 2-hour conversation where we all generally agree that most of the moral panic stuff with games was crap. And then we shift over to VR, and immediately, and I don't just mean you, all of us, we have to reconcile this. This is where we're at now, right? There are some folks who are like, this is terrible. It's a breach of morality. It cheapens human life. And there are some folks that are like, coping is coping. Is this any different than a photo album? Is this any different than the person who keeps their child's room exactly as it was when they passed away? Or is it just an accelerated version of something old? I don't know. It's a great question, right? But we have the capacity now to basically deep fake our kid and keep them alive. I don't know. Like, and so maybe
I think that's a bad thing in the grand scheme of things. I personally believe that will only end poorly.
Well, so that's the question, though. We can only use our anchor, and that's kind of the whole point of this discussion. We can only use our anchor. I mean, the generation before us said the exact same thing about all of us going online and making friends with strangers and shooting things and tearing hearts out. And yet we didn't burn the world down, right? We're still, I mean, it is burning around us. We're not the ones doing it. I will point to my militia neighbors, right? Maybe norms just change over time. You ever heard of Ray Kurzweil? Kurzweil's singularity argument is that we're quickly approaching a technological epoch where there will be enough computing power to accurately simulate the human body, or rather the human mind, to which point we can ask ourselves the question, do we actually need this to live? Because the flesh bag has limitations, right? It can only live for so long. It needs nourishment. We need to stay healthy. But if we could live in a processor, we could live forever. It challenges the very root of how we see the world. And of course, on the one hand, we have to have these conversations because we're the ones involved in their development. But we always have to ask ourselves, like, what are we exactly uncomfortable about? You know, like, what is the actual threat? And how do we manage it? Because in some ways, it's not any different than the horseless carriage. It's going to fundamentally change our entire infrastructure. What are we going to do about all these other things that we have that are no longer compatible with reality? And this one is, what do we do when we can start simulating people to where we don't need other people anymore? You know,
I can give another example in regards to something, a panic that surrounded VR.
Sure, please.
So I remember this. Basically, there was, I think this was like maybe around 2013 or 14, so kind of the early days of it. I remember a decent amount of people were not really, were having some panic, not in regards to, let's say, the tech too much, but more of like what we do. What they were more particularly panicked about was regards to how this would be used in terms of pornography.
That's what's on slide right now. Yeah, VR porn.
Yeah, and that's the, and you know, like the whole thing that kind of surrounded is that early in the stages, I think is correct. Like the early people researching the VR and getting into development, a lot of them were pornography companies. So,
and that's been something throughout tech history, believe it or not. The VHS survived largely because of Mr. Rogers and porn. And I am not making this up. Mr. Rogers argued that children need to be able to learn, and they can only do that if they can watch the lessons later. Why did the porn industry want VHS?
Because it was easy to make your own recordings of it, and therefore you could distribute it very quickly because you could copy it.
That was one. There was a bigger one, though, and it had to do with how porn was delivered prior.
Distribution.
It used to be you had to go to a theater and watch it.
Really?
Yeah.
Well, but Betamax existed, and so
well, they were fighting at the same time, right?
Yes,
prior
and
to
that's
idea.
why VHS survived and Betamax died. Because
right.
Because VHS was much easier to home make and distribute than Betamax was.
That's correct. But the idea behind why the porn industry would give a damn about portable recordings is that their industry saw the potential to go, wow, if we could sell this to you and you could watch it on your own. Mm-hmm. Because the technical benefits of VHS, Hollywood was terrified of. And so was the TV industry, because they were like, no one's ever going to watch a movie again. No one's ever going to come to the theater. No one's ever going to watch live TV ever again. But we saw the distribution in other models. And so I pointed out because if you look at the history of pornography and tech innovation, it's not the first time. Porn was very involved in Blu-ray. Very involved in 3D. Very involved in 3D. Because what's their industry selling?
Sex.
Well, and it's simulated sex, right? They have more to gain on the technologies than other people do. By the way, porn also was largely in charge of a lot of the digital rights management stuff in the early days too, because they were losing all of their money because people don't like to buy pornography because it's embarrassing and all these other things, right?
I think I can insert one of my questions here, going off of what Javi was saying.
Mm-hmm.
So like due to the cathartic nature of games, is it possible that VR porno might cut down on violence, sexual assault, and rape?
So there's two things.
are likely to commit those acts as critics of video games believe that video games do.
So the first thing I'm going to point out is there is no evidence for catharsis effects. There isn't any scientific evidence that doing bad things makes you feel good later. There is evidence for what's called eudaimonia, where you reflect on your actions. But the idea of catharsis has never been demonstrated in data. We use it as a sort of cultural metaphor, but there's no evidence for it. Because for something to be cathartic, it has to be a bad experience with a good result. And that's not what happens. What happens is we reframe things while we're consuming them. So I only throw it out there because that term, I often ban it in my classes because it doesn't exist. But to the question of can doing bad things make you think differently, that's been the major question today. Like with the violence stuff, does throwing a white phosphorus grenade at people make you, right, want to throw more grenades later, or does it make you contemplate? The tricky part with pornography is that it's one of the few areas of media research where the effects are actually pretty strong and they're pretty negative. That like when people watch pornography, more often than not, they endorse what's called the rape myth. The rape myth is the idea that rape usually has a, you can explain it away. It's, oh, well, she was dressed a certain way. She didn't say no, things like this. And there's a lot of research suggesting that people who watch heavily sexually aggressive media are more likely to endorse the rape myth. So I think from that perspective, what you would probably find in a VR rape simulation is that you're unlikely to find positive effects. But it's also in context, right? Because there's also been movies that have used rape scenes, but use them in a way to tell a narrative in a context that is very different, isn't it? So like, has anybody ever seen the movie Clockwork Orange?
Yep.
Yeah, there's a brutal rape in the middle of the movie. Or Death Wish. You know? So what happens is it probably has to do with the narrative container more so than just having sex on screen. Right? Because the implicit, and the reason we think pornography effects are so strong is because there's an implicit reward. It's sex. But when you narratively frame them, people might process it differently, if that makes any sense. So that's kind of the wild question there. So to go back to tech and immersion and the idea of evolving stories, it's not just that video games have become more immersive, it's that as they've become more immersive, and I'm talking about the technology side, they've also matured in their storytelling capabilities so that you could show a scene and then also frame it in a way to where people process it differently, right? Spec Ops The Line challenged you, but it also told you it was challenging you, right? So there was a reflection there. Does that make sense? So probably the mainline effects, pornography is one of the few areas where it's actually been demonstrated that there's a pretty bad effect. But when you narratively frame it, it works. You know, so there's going to be and that was going back to the beginning of the class. One of the reasons why we try to separate out immersion and presence and narrative, because they're all a little different from each other, right? And those parts work quite well. And by the way, rewinding back on something, I want to make sure that Alex knows this. He was talking about the death of Betamax being mostly porn and self-recordings. And
well,
that was
so
accurate.
When a technology arises, there are three separate uses that are tested out for it. First, and the first application is always military. Can it be applied in the military for weapons purpose or intelligence purpose or anything? Second is medical. Can it be applied to healing people, fixing anything, or any other line? And then third is porn.
Yeah, and I don't know if I would say it's that definitive, but it's an interesting framework, right? We know like the early email came from military and then it came from data sharing. But there's kind of like this recurring knowledge that we tend to see these sectors take something off, and then if they can use it, then everybody else can use it. I don't know if I'd say it's like a one-to-one, this is it, but we definitely see that pop up. And if you go back and look at cable, Betamax, VHS, 3D, game controllers, We're flying drones with Xbox controllers, right? Oh, we're actually getting towards the end here. Cyber sickness pops up, and this one may not be a moral panic, right? It's a thing. Many of you talked about it, right? This number, I was not able to validate this figure. I don't think that number is accurate. But what we do know is for sure we see experiences where people get disoriented when they're in cyberspace. And it's a barrier towards adoption, right? Because you put on this helmet and you go to a new world and you're sick when you're there. You know, nausea is pretty common. People get tired, they get fatigued more quickly. And some of this has to do with your body is constantly having to recalibrate because it can't quite reconcile the differences here and there. Has anybody on the call experienced like some form of cyber sickness?
Oh, yeah.
I did in my
flashbacks.
Go ahead.
When I was back in 2016, when I first got my HTC Vive, I used to have very serious motion sickness. I couldn't even look at my phone in the car, or else I would basically puke. And then I started playing VR, and it pretty much disappeared overnight.
And some of that's because the brain gets better at processing everything. Riley, you had something in Jared.
Oh, well, yeah. I've had visual flashbacks for sure. Like, it was like really random and I was really tired, but I had like taken the headset off. I had been playing Skyrim for like 8 hours and I took the headset off. And then for a second, I was like, I felt like I had like a magic in my hands. It went away like after that. Never had it after that either.
Jared, what was yours?
Yeah, when I first started playing VR, I definitely got the motion sickness. And there were a few times where I had this weird disconnect where I was trying to move by moving the stick forward or pressing certain buttons.
And that happens. Mm-hmm.
That's something you get over with time. It's something you kind of learn and get used to.
And in the early technologies, it was worse, right? There are lots of reasons why it didn't work very well. And a lot of this has to do with you have to reconcile. And it's especially bad when you're sitting down, right? Because your body's moving and you're not. And that one can trip people up quite a bit. Here's kind of, I won't go over it in too much detail, but it's an interesting path towards like, essentially what's going on here is that your body is trying to anticipate things and perceive them at the same time, and things get tripped up. But you can read that on your own sometime. Interestingly enough, one of their readings talked about psychosis, that VR would like lead us to not be able to distinguish real from fake. And there's no evidence on this. This is just a speculation, right? And you can see why somebody who is not knowing what it is might think that, right? Like you're putting on headsets and you're meeting your dead daughter and you're having sex with people and you're going to take your headset off and you're just going to like fall into psychosis and you're never going to be able to distinguish reality from fantasy ever again. I mean, even on our own call, we addressed like potential things that could make this wrong. And if someone were to be like lost in their dead relatives or something like this, that this would be dangerous to their psyche. I suspect that it will be a matter of time before you see the psychosis debate come up. I don't think it's going to take long before that moral panic. I think once those headsets start selling, I think you're going to see the psychosis debate pop up. You know, whether or not people can distinguish reality from fantasy when they're living in both. Especially when we start spending lots of time in both spaces. Because, I mean, a lot of folks already talk about social media being like a dangerous space you shouldn't spend time in. Now, wait until that environment's a real one, where you put your headset on and you walk over there, right? Now, the video here that we don't have time to show, unfortunately, but you should watch it on your own, and I posted it in the Discord for Tech VR, is there's a lot of research actually using VR to treat psychosis by helping people understand how to process reality. And if you watch this video, it's a really great example of using a VR simulator to have somebody walk through London city streets. And, you know, part of having psychoses is you think things are happening around you that aren't happening. And so what this one does is they put people in the simulator who have psychosis, and then they have them walk around the streets, and they'll be like a stranger on the road. And the person in the simulator will start freaking out. Like, that person's judging me. And then the clinician says, no, look at them again. They're just talking to their friend. And the idea is to get people to realize that they don't have to reinterpret reality. Does that make sense? So one is like a guy comes up behind you while you're buying your tickets. And somebody who's psychotic might get really nervous about that. And then the simulator shows, oh, he's just buying his own tickets. He's not following me because now he's ahead of me. And then the person in the simulator goes, oh, yeah, I recognize the patterns. These people aren't out to get me and things like this. You should definitely watch it on your own. One idea is context. So big problem in VR is we just want to simulate everything. And like, we're not asking people if they want these things to be simulated. Like, I don't know if I want to like relive my conception. All right. You could do it. Like, I could put you in the simulator and then... Although what freaked me out about this image is these feet are not the same size. Like, I was a little weirded out by that one. But, you know, it goes back a little bit to what Alex was mentioning. Like, do we want to, or Jared as well, do we want to simulate everything? Because we can, right? We certainly can. But again, go ahead, Jared.
We should.
But again, that came up in film. A lot of folks critique Steven Spielberg. Why are you recreating the Holocaust? What benefit is that? All you're going to do is scare people. All you're going to do is anger people. All you're going to do is exploit this tragedy for your own ends. Why are you replicating that? Like, these same debates came up in film and still come up in film. It's an interesting thing. Like, it doesn't mean the VR debate's any less important. But what's wild about moral panics is that they perpetuate. And if we go back and look at old moral panics, it might help us understand new moral panics and put them in a lens. Some people talked about photography as fraudulent, as recreating experiences that shouldn't be had. Again, doesn't mean we should be any less concerned about, you know, the Korean child simulator, but it is something to think about. You know, maybe we've actually dealt with some of these things before. You know, we can reenact the invasion of the beach in Normandy, but should we do it historically? Should we do it for entertainment value? What's the reaction going to be in people playing it? You know, things like that. Jared, were there any things you wanted to add about moral panic in VR to kind of get back at your last question, and then we'll wrap after that?
Yeah, I can. Because, well, full dive VR is seen in like TV shows.
And can you explain that just for everybody on the call? We say full dive VR.
It's where you put on a headset and you lay down on your bed or something, and it basically hijacks your brain to send inputs from your brain into the computer space. And so you're in the environment physically, and you can feel things, and it's all there. And
it's not even immersion anymore in a weird, in a way, it's like a weird type of immersion because we actually intercept the brain signals that make you think you're doing things while you're literally just out.
Yeah, I described it as a fully immersive technology.
Yeah. We've embodied, and it's weird, right? Because we're not even embodying, we're embodying your body, but doing it at the neurological level.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But, and my question was, how will that affect our society? Will it be beneficial or detrimental? And do the pros outweigh the cons? And I added a note, no, it will be a moral panic.
So that is the singularity argument, if you're not familiar with it. Read on the singularity. And it is the argument that at one point we will converge online. Has anybody in this call read Neil Stephenson's Fall? If this topic interests you, read that book. It's long. It's like 400, 500 pages, and it's kind of dense. But it's an entire book about the very first human to go full dive. And it's fascinating because it actually brings up, you can imagine, the whole book is on all the moral panics involved. I'll give one slight plot twist. Where's that computing power going to come from? And it's this interesting thing where it's like, can we all full dive if someone's got to keep the computer on? or we can't do it. And not to mention, Jared, I think what you're getting at is when you're in full dive, the flesh bag is completely exposed, right? Like, you're out.
And who's not to say that if you're intercepting the brain waves, why can't someone, or the neurological, why can't someone go through the headset and intercept from the neck down.
And yeah, right, Zach, there could be backwards compatibility, right? Like, why can't we just get you up the slab and walk around? Anybody seen Sword Art Online?
Yes.
That is this story, isn't it? It's a full dive system where you put the helmet on and then they lock you down. And I think it's on Netflix now, actually, if I'm not mistaken.
I know Avery really.
It's also Overlord.
Yeah, Phil's talking about the Robot Island, which is actually one of my favorites, where BMO comes from. The BMO factory, if you haven't been there before. The full dive system is, and actually, Jared, I'm a little, and maybe to wrap, why do we think folks aren't talking about it
more? Just because VR hasn't really become mainstream.
Maybe it's just so far away that it's like we don't even know how to, like it's so many status quos away. But it is a stated goal.
I think it's only a handful away.
But remember, I'm talking about perceptions. Like in the perception of the audience, we just now got our Quest, right? And it's still seen as kind of unattainable, kind of fancy. Like if you go to somebody's house and ask if they have a Quest, they're not going to get everybody's hand in the air, right? But I do think that that's where it starts. You have a headset that's connected to your social media account. That's a form of full dive in terms of now there's a one-to-one identity match between who you are and what's on your head. Does that make sense? I mean, from a business model, it's fascinating and it's strange that I never thought VR would be something that would be personal. I always thought it would just be a device in your house. Oculus is clearly pushing this as a personal device where you own a smartphone, right? And you own a headset. And we know the person who's wearing that headset. We know what they like. We know what they do. We know where they visit. We know where they go. Right? And it's a weird form of like social full diving. I mean, your data's out there. And so you start getting at the metaphor between that to actually diving in, you, right? Avery mentions that there's already some gear out there. It's getting there, right? Of course, there's always matters of scale, right? If you don't have a server, where are we going to full dive to?
I find it interesting. You said you never really thought VR as something like that, like personal.
Mm-hmm.
Like I would say that your online avatar, like they're like stories of people getting married from meeting.
Oh yeah, there's a lot of research on people owning objects online. Absolutely. What we're getting at, I think, is the coupling between the online and the offline, where we're marrying things one-to-one, right? Like I never thought of my game controller as mine. It's just a controller on my PlayStation, right? But we're getting to a level of coupling now where the digital object and the physical object become the same thing, which is why we're getting into some of these new questions about what is going to happen online. And yeah, I don't know. It's a great question. This is an area that probably needs a lot more scholarship, frankly. We don't see too much. A lot of the current discussions around new technologies are in robotics and AI. So I think the other reason why we're not thinking about full dive VR is that we're distracted. I think we're really interested in AI. We're really interested in robotics. And those areas get a lot of the attention. But I think the VR side is still just seen as not that serious. Which should probably change, right? This would be a cool thing, by the way, for the VR Club. This would be a good debate to hold, like as an event. Invite some people who study this stuff and like see what they would throw out there.
Are you saying you want us to invite you to debate this?
I don't know if I want to be part of it, but I can give you some names. I could be a good moderator. I would just yell at everybody. But it is, I could think of some VR scholars who'd be interested in doing that, like talking about what is the implications of this. What are the moral panics that are going to come up? Because I don't know what they are yet. To me, psychosis seems like the low-hanging fruit in a way. Like there's other things we could be talking about.
I mean, a lot of the initial like mental issues, a lot of them you just kind of get over after.
Oh, you're talking about the cyber sickness stuff. Yeah, that's mostly temporal. It's once you use it for a while, it goes away. And again, there's a lot of evidence that if anything, we've been using VR to treat psychoses, which is pretty fascinating, right? Well, we're a bit over. Okay. So I want to wrap us in interest of time. Thank you for today. This was awesome. I really appreciate the engagement today. This was particularly strong. Takeaways are that moral panics, they can come from a place of good, but they tend to be more about the fear of the unknown. They can help us prevent mistakes, but they also stifle development because we start saying, I'm not going to bother doing that because it might be something wrong. And we sometimes just use the label of ethics. What we really mean is we're uncomfortable. And those aren't the same thing, right? So really cool conversation. I know this one's a little weird that the class leaves with more questions and answers because the gaming stuff did one thing and the VR stuff's just this big fat question mark. I think for those people who joined this conversation during that week, you can already see there's a lot to talk about. And what I might encourage you to do, get a head start and post some of those thoughts while they're still fresh on your mind. And by the way, one of the things you can do if you're trying to manage workloads, the questions you're asking for class, you can always customize those and ask them again in the discussion because our students in Zhengda don't get to see what's happening here. So I wouldn't copy and paste, but you can definitely dive in there and share a bit. Any final thoughts before I shut us down for the day? Okay, I think it's all I got. Folks, I really appreciate this one. I'm really happy this is coming along. We'll stay in touch on the forums. I'll catch you later. Bye.